I am Natalie, 33 years old, and my father slapped me across the face on his 65th birthday in front of 200 guests. He looked at the rare antique I spent 6 months restoring, called it worthless garbage, and threw it into a champagne bucket. My family laughed while I bled on the marble floor. I walked out into the freezing Chicago rain with nothing but the clothes on my back. But just 3 hours later, I was pulled into the back of a bulletproof SUV by a billionaire stranger who handed me a file and said 4 words that destroyed my entire reality. I am your real father. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight to take your life back from toxic family members. Growing up in the Thorne household meant understanding your exact place in the hierarchy. My adoptive parents, Richard and Patricia Thorne, made sure I knew mine. Richard was a titan in Chicago, owning the largest chain of luxury car dealerships in the Midwest. Our sprawling mansion in the northern suburbs was a monument to his ego, filled with imported marble crystal chandeliers and people whose affection could be bought. Tonight was his 65th birthday gala, and the house was packed with local politicians, wealthy socialites, and rival dealership owners. The air smelled of expensive cologne, roasted prime rib, and old money. I stood nervously near the grand staircase, clutching a small, carefully wrapped velvet box. I worked as a freelance user experience designer, a career Richard frequently dismissed as a silly computer hobby for people who could not handle real business. My dress was simple and modest, a stark contrast to the sea of designer gowns around me. Across the enormous room, my younger sister Vanessa and her husband Jamal were holding court. Vanessa was 30, the undisputed golden child and the marketing director for Richard's company. She wore a diamond necklace that caught the light with every condescending laugh. Jamal, her husband, was 32, a brilliant African-American man who served as the chief financial officer of the Thorne Auto Empire. He was sharp, ambitious, and completely blinded by the wealth Richard tossed their way. The music faded as Richard tapped his crystal glass. It was time for the gift presentation, the most theatrical part of any Thorne family event. Vanessa and Jamal went first. They stepped into the center of the room, beaming with self-satisfaction, and handed Richard a small black box. He opened it and pulled out a shiny set of keys. A brand-new custom Porsche 911 was parked in the circular driveway. The crowd erupted into applause and cheers. Richard pulled Vanessa into a tight hug and clapped Jamal on the back, declaring them the future of the Thorne legacy. Then the room quieted, and every eye turned to me. I swallowed hard and stepped forward. I did not have Porsche money, but I had something I thought was far more valuable. For the past 6 months, I had worked with private antique dealers to track down the exact silver pocket watch that had belonged to Richard's own father. It was a beautiful, intricate timepiece that Richard had spoken about with rare affection during my childhood. I had spent thousands of dollars, nearly draining my modest savings, to have it fully restored and functioning perfectly. I handed the velvet box to him, my hands shaking slightly under the weight of 200 stares. I explained what it was, hoping to see a glimpse of genuine emotion in his eyes. Richard opened the box. He stared at the gleaming silver watch. The room held its breath. Then his face twisted into a sneer of pure disgust. "What kind of worthless junk is this?" he roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Before I could even process the words, he turned and dropped the antique watch straight into a silver bucket filled with ice and champagne. I gasped and reached forward instinctively to pull it out. "Do not touch my things," he barked. His hand swung out, striking me across the face with a sickening crack. The force of the slap sent me stumbling backward. My heel caught on the edge of the rug and I crashed hard onto the cold marble floor. The sharp sting radiated across my cheek, and I tasted copper as my teeth cut into my lip. I looked up, expecting anyone to step forward. Instead, a wave of laughter rippled from across the room. Vanessa was giggling, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. Jamal shook his head, leaning over to whisper to a nearby client, saying she has always been the family embarrassment. The crowd of so-called friends and elite guests just watched, murmuring to each other, their faces filled with pity and amusement. Patricia, the woman who was supposed to be my mother, stepped out of the crowd. She wore a stunning emerald gown and an expression made of ice. She did not reach down to help me. She did not ask if I was hurt. She looked down at me like I was a stain on her expensive floor. "Stop humiliating this family," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a harsh, cold whisper that cut through the remaining silence. "Grab your trash and get out of my house before I call the police." I sat there for a fraction of a second, letting the absolute reality of my life sink in. There would be no defense. There would be no apologies. This was not a family. It was a performance, and I had just been written out of the script. I did not cry. I did not beg. I slowly pushed myself up from the marble floor, wiping a small drop of blood from the corner of my mouth. I picked up my purse, ignoring the stinging pain in my cheek and the hundreds of eyes burning into my back. I turned around and walked straight out the heavy double doors. The cold, biting wind of a Chicago storm hit me instantly as I stepped onto the driveway. The rain was pouring down in sheets, soaking my thin dress within seconds. Behind me, the heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, cutting off the warmth, the music, and the laughter of the people who had just thrown me away. I walked down the long, winding driveway past the shiny new Porsche, pulling my thin coat tighter around my shoulders, heading into the dark, freezing streets, with absolutely nothing left to lose. The freezing rain lashed against my face as I stumbled down the long, winding driveway, leaving the opulent Thorne estate behind me. The heavy gates clicked shut with a metallic finality, locking me out of the only world I had ever known. I pulled my thin coat tighter around my shoulders, shivering as the icy wind cut right through the soaked fabric of my dress. My ruined heels clicked unevenly against the wet pavement. I reached the end of the block and turned onto a darker tree-lined avenue bordered by massive manicured hedges that offered no shelter from the storm. I pulled out my phone, my fingers numb and trembling desperately, trying to open a ride-sharing app. Raindrops splattered across the screen, making it glitch and jump under my touch. The battery icon flashed a bright warning red. The estimated wait time for a driver was 25 minutes, a lifetime, when you are standing alone in the freezing dark with a bruised cheek and a shattered reality. As I stood under the flickering glow of a solitary streetlight, uninvited, memories flooded my mind fast and sharp like broken glass. I remembered being 12 years old, shivering in the Chicago winter because Patricia forced me to wear Vanessa's oversized, discarded coats. The fabric always smelled faintly of Vanessa's expensive perfume, a daily suffocating reminder of my secondary status in their home. I remembered sitting at the dining room table at 18, proudly showing Richard the very first website interface I had coded from scratch. He had barely glanced at the screen before letting out a loud, mocking laugh, calling my hard work a pathetic joke, and demanding I clear the table so Jamal could spread out real financial reports. I remembered Thanksgiving 3 years ago, standing on their front porch with a homemade pie knocking on the locked door. I had seen Patricia staring at me through the front window. She held my gaze for a long, agonizing moment before coldly pulling the curtains shut, punishing me for refusing to cancel a critical freelance client meeting just to run mundane errands for Vanessa. Every cruel remark, every discarded gift, every time they paraded Vanessa and Jamal around like royalty, while treating me like an unpaid servant, it all suddenly made terrifying sense. I was never a daughter to them. I was a prop, an obligation they resented carrying. The throbbing pain in my cheek from Richard's slap was nothing compared to the hollow ache in my chest. I wiped a mixture of rain and tears from my eyes, staring down at my dying phone screen. Suddenly, a pair of blinding white headlights swept across the wet asphalt, casting long, distorted shadows against the hedges. I looked up, squinting against the glare. A massive, matte black, bulletproof SUV came tearing around the corner. Its tires screeched against the slick pavement, throwing up a wave of dirty water as the vehicle suddenly swerved and mounted the curb directly in front of me, cutting off my only path of escape. My heart hammered against my ribs. Adrenaline flooded my veins, completely overriding the freezing cold. I dropped my phone, hearing it shatter against the concrete. Before I could even turn to run, the heavy side door of the SUV slid open with a sharp mechanical hiss. Two massive men stepped out into the pouring rain. They wore immaculate dark suits and moved with terrifying synchronized speed. They did not shout. They did not hesitate. I spun around, my wet shoes slipping on the pavement, but they were too fast. One man grabbed my left arm with a grip like an iron vise, while the other seized my right shoulder. I screamed for help, thrashing and kicking wildly against their legs. I twisted my body, fighting with every ounce of strength I had left, but it was entirely useless against their sheer physical power. The storm swallowed my cries. In one smooth, coordinated motion, they lifted me entirely off the ground and shoved me forcefully into the cavernous back seat of the vehicle. I tumbled onto the floorboards, gasping for air, scrambling frantically backward against the plush leather seats. The heavy door slid shut behind me, sealing with a heavy thud that instantly cut off the howling wind and the crashing rain. The interior of the SUV was completely silent, warm, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and cedar. I pushed myself up into the corner, my chest heaving, prepared to fight whoever was inside. I looked across the spacious, dimly lit cabin, my breathing ragged and shallow. Sitting directly opposite me was a man. He looked to be in his early 60s, impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that radiated quiet authority. His posture was completely relaxed, his hands resting easily on a silver-headed cane. But it was his face that made the frantic beating of my heart suddenly stall. He had sharp, defined features, silver hair at his temples, and piercing blue eyes. As he looked at me, a profound, unsettling familiarity washed over me. I was looking into a mirror. Those were my eyes. That was my jawline. The absolute terror I felt just seconds ago was abruptly swallowed by an overwhelming, paralyzing confusion. He leaned forward slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements smooth and his hands entirely visible so as not to frighten me further. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crisp white linen handkerchief. He held it out to me. His piercing blue eyes drifted to the swelling dark bruise on my cheek, the fresh mark left by Richard Thorne. For a fraction of a second, a flash of absolute cold fury ignited in his expression, a dangerous rage directed at whoever had hurt me. But just as quickly as it appeared, he suppressed it, softening his features completely. He looked at me with an expression of profound sorrow, mixed with a desperate, overwhelming relief. "Hello, dear," he said, his voice deep, anchoring and trembling with decades of contained emotion. "I am Harrison Cole. I am your biological father." I stared at him, the words echoing in the confined, luxurious space of the SUV. The rain pounded against the reinforced glass outside, but inside the silence was deafening. My biological father. The concept felt entirely alien. For 33 years I had believed I was an unwanted burden, a tragic charity case graciously taken in by the Thorne family. I looked down at the crisp linen handkerchief he offered, then back up at his face. The physical resemblance was undeniable. We shared the same sharp jawline and the same piercing blue eyes, but trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. I did not take the handkerchief. I pushed myself further back into the leather seat, my mind racing for an escape route. Harrison Cole seemed to expect this reaction. He did not offer empty platitudes or beg for my immediate affection. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder marked with red classified stamps. He slid it across the center console onto my lap. "Read it," he said softly. "I do not expect you to take the word of a stranger who just pulled you off the street, but numbers and legal documents do not lie." My hands shook as I opened the folder. The first page was a laboratory DNA report from a facility I recognized as one of the most reputable in the country. The probability of paternity was 99.9%. Beneath that was a birth certificate. The paper was old, slightly yellowed at the edges. It listed my name as Natalie Cole, mother Elena Cole, father Harrison Cole. There was no mention of Richard or Patricia Thorne. I flipped to the next section. It contained heavily redacted police reports and medical files dating back 28 years. Harrison watched my eyes scan the pages before he began to speak, his voice steady but laced with a profound decades-old grief. 28 years ago, I was not the venture capitalist I am today, he explained. I ran a rapidly growing investment firm in California, Richard Thorne was a low-level accountant working in my Chicago branch office. He was a nobody. He handled basic tax filings and payroll. Harrison paused, his jaw tightening as he looked at the police report in my hands. Your mother and I were visiting Chicago for a business acquisition. We had you with us. You were just 5 years old. We were driving back to our hotel when a drunk driver ran a red light and T-boned our vehicle at 60 miles per hour. The impact killed your mother instantly. I was thrown from the vehicle and suffered massive head trauma. I slipped into a coma that lasted for 14 months. When I finally woke up, my world was gone. Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. My wife was dead. And the hospital staff told me my daughter had perished in the crash as well. I spent the next 20 years believing I had buried both of you. It was not until my legal team began auditing old company archives 6 months ago that we found the discrepancies. I looked up from the documents, my mind struggling to process the absolute magnitude of the lie. How did Richard get me? He collaborated with a corrupt, now disbarred family court lawyer. Harrison said, his tone turning venomous. Richard knew about your mother's personal accounts. He knew that upon her death, a $5 million irrevocable trust fund was designated entirely for your care and upbringing. While I was lying on life support, Richard fabricated adoption papers. He paid off local officials to declare you a ward of the state and fast-tracked a closed adoption. He effectively erased Natalie Cole from existence and created Natalie Thorne. Harrison reached over and flipped to the final section of the folder. It was a stack of bank statements, transfer logs, and corporate incorporation documents. Richard did not take you out of charity, Harrison said. He took you because you were a walking bank account. Look at the ledger. I stared at the highlighted columns. Millions of dollars had been systematically withdrawn from an account bearing my mother's name. The withdrawal reasons were categorized as exceptional childcare expenses, educational trusts, and medical needs. Yet the destination of these funds was not a private school or a hospital. The money flowed directly into a series of shell companies that eventually funded the very first Thorne luxury auto dealership. A cold, heavy realization settled deep in my stomach. The extravagant mansion I was just thrown out of, the designer clothes Vanessa flaunted on social media, the brand new Porsche Jamal had just purchased. Every single piece of the Thorne family empire was bought and paid for with my dead mother's money. I was never a burden. I was the foundation of their entire wealth. They had stolen my identity, stolen my family, and stolen my future to fund their greed. And then they had the audacity to call me a failure. The stinging pain on my cheek where Richard had slapped me suddenly felt like a badge of war. The tears that had been threatening to fall completely evaporated. The scared, eager to please daughter who just wanted her family's approval died in the back of that SUV. A new emotion took over, sharp, cold, and entirely focused. Harrison leaned forward, his blue eyes blazing with a protective fury. I have a team of federal litigators waiting on standby, he said. We can have Richard and Jamal arrested by morning. I have enough evidence to put them in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. We will seize the dealerships, auction the house, and watch them rot behind bars. Say the word, Natalie, and I will destroy them tonight. I looked at the bank statements, tracing the numbers with my finger, then slowly closed the folder. The rain continued to beat against the roof of the SUV in a rhythmic, steady drum. Prison was a swift punishment. It meant a clean break, a sudden end. But Richard Thorne thrived on his reputation. His entire identity was wrapped up in being a self-made titan, a wealthy patriarch who looked down on everyone else. Taking his freedom was not enough. I wanted to take his pride. I wanted to watch him realize that the daughter he abused was the architect of his total ruin. No, I said. My voice was eerily calm, completely devoid of the fear I had felt just moments ago. Harrison stopped, looking at me in genuine surprise. Prison is too easy. I continued, meeting his gaze directly. If you arrest him now, he gets to play the victim. He gets to hire expensive lawyers and fight it out in court for years while hiding his offshore assets. I want him to lose everything he built with my mother's money, right when he thinks he is at the absolute top. I want him to hand his empire over willingly. Harrison's surprise slowly melted into a look of profound respect. A sharp, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. You have your mother's mind, he said softly. What are you thinking? I need access to your forensic accountants, I said, leaning forward. Richard and Jamal run a tight ship publicly, but Jamal is arrogant. If they are willing to steal $5 million from an orphaned child, they are definitely cutting corners elsewhere. We are not going to attack them legally right now. We are going to attack them financially. We are going to back them into a corner and make them beg us to take their company. The flight to California was a blur of quiet luxury and intense strategy. Harrison's private jet cut through the night sky, carrying us far away from the freezing rain of Chicago. I sat in a plush leather seat staring out the window at the endless expanse of darkness. For the first time in my life, I felt entirely safe. Harrison did not overwhelm me with fatherly demands. He gave me space, ordering his staff to provide me with dry, comfortable clothes and hot food. As the sun began to rise over the hills of Silicon Valley, illuminating the sprawling tech campuses below, I knew the terrified, eager-to-please girl I had been was gone forever. We arrived at the headquarters of Apex Ventures, Harrison's massive investment firm. His personal office was a fortress of glass steel and cutting-edge technology. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city, holding a mug of black coffee. It was time to strike the first match. I pulled out the new secure smartphone Harrison's security team had provided me. I dialed a number I had memorized since childhood. Patricia answered on the third ring. Her voice was sharp-laced with the same arrogant annoyance she had projected at the gala. "Where are you?" she snapped. "I told you to get your trash off my property, not disappear. Your father is furious about the scene you caused." "He is not my father," I replied, my voice steady, completely drained of the anxiety that used to choke me whenever I spoke to her. "And I am not calling to apologize. I want my original adoption records, Patricia, all of them. Send them to my email by noon." The line went dead silent. The sudden suffocating pause told me everything I needed to know. The arrogant matriarch of the Thorne family was suddenly terrified. "What are you talking about?" she finally stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "You heard me. The original files from 28 years ago. Have them ready." I hung up and placed the phone on the glass desk. I looked over at Harrison, who was watching me from his leather armchair with a look of profound pride. "They are going to panic," I said calmly. "Richard and Jamal will not wait to see what I know. They will try to crush me immediately to silence me." Less than 2 hours later, the retaliation began. I sat at a sleek workstation logging into my personal and business bank accounts to pay one of my freelance contractors. I typed in my password and hit enter. The screen flashed bright red. A bold notification blocked my access. "Account frozen. Contact your branch manager regarding suspected fraudulent activity." I refreshed the page. Every single account linked to my name-checking savings business had been locked down. Jamal was moving fast. As the chief financial officer of a massive auto empire, he possessed extensive connections in the regional banking sector. He knew exactly who to call and what lies to tell to initiate an emergency freeze on my assets. He was utilizing his corporate leverage to starve me out, assuming I was still a helpless freelancer wandering the streets of Chicago with no resources. My phone buzzed on his desk. A text message from Jamal illuminated the screen. "You bite the hand that feeds you, you starve. Good luck buying lunch today." I slid the phone across the desk toward Harrison. He read the message, his jaw tightening, and reached for his desk phone to unleash his legal team. I shook my head, stopping him. "Let them think they are winning," I said, taking another sip of coffee. "When arrogant men think they have the upper hand, they get sloppy." 10 minutes later, the attack escalated. My professional email inbox began chiming relentlessly. A rapid, cascading series of notifications flooded my screen. A major tech startup I had been consulting for sent a harsh, one-line email terminating my contract effective immediately. A healthcare app developer pulled out of a 6-month user interface redesign project we had finalized just yesterday. Client after client severed ties in a matter of minutes. My phone vibrated again. It was a message from an old industry colleague. She sent a screenshot of an email she had received. I read the text, my blood running cold. Vanessa had been busy. My sister had systematically contacted every major client in my professional network. Utilizing the official Thorn dealership corporate letterhead, Vanessa claimed that I had been terminated as a family contractor due to severe data theft. She fabricated a story that I had stolen proprietary customer financial data from their servers and warned my clients that I was currently under active federal investigation. It was character assassination on an industrial scale designed to completely obliterate my 5-year career in a single morning. Vanessa followed up her sabotage with a direct text message to my phone. "Go back to the gutter. Go against the thorns and you won't survive in this city. You are nothing without us." I sat in the plush leather chair in Harrison's office, the morning sunlight warming my face. Yesterday, losing my entire client base and having my bank accounts frozen would have sent me into a devastating panic attack. I would have been crying, begging them to stop apologizing for whatever imaginary slight I had committed. But today, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating resolve. They were fighting a ghost. They were attacking a desperate freelancer who no longer existed, completely unaware that I was currently sitting inside a billionaire's fortress backed by resources they could not even comprehend. The heavy glass doors of the office slid open. Harrison's lead forensic accountant, a sharp-looking man named Marcus, strode into the room carrying a secure tablet. He connected it to the massive wall monitor mounted behind Harrison's desk. "You were right," Natalie Marcus said, tapping the screen. "The Thorn Auto Empire is a house of cards. They project extreme wealth, but their internal ledgers are bleeding out." Complex financial diagrams, debt ratios, and offshore banking structures materialized on the enormous screen. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the data. Jamal had been playing a very dangerous game. Behind Richard's back, or perhaps with his desperate approval, Jamal had been secretly leveraging the dealership's physical assets to fund massive investments in unregulated offshore real estate and highly volatile cryptocurrency ventures. The market had recently turned against him, and the losses were catastrophic. "They are drowning." Harrison noted his voice carrying a lethal edge as he studied the red numbers illuminating the room. "They are 60 days away from missing their commercial loan covenants. If they do not secure a massive capital injection immediately, the banks will seize the dealerships. Total bankruptcy." "They stole $5 million from my mother to build this empire," I said softly, staring at the screen. "And Jamal's arrogance is going to burn it to the ground. They are desperate. And desperate men are easily trapped." I picked up my phone, looked at Vanessa's threatening message, and typed my reply. I did not insult her. I did not defend myself. I sent a single ominous sentence. "I hope your balance sheets are accurate." I hit send, turning my attention back to the massive monitor. It was time to cast the line and let them swallow the hook. Harrison's legal architects moved with lethal efficiency. Within 48 hours, Apex Ventures, LLC is born. It is a masterpiece of corporate illusion registered in Delaware, featuring a glossy website, a roster of phantom board members, and a registered office in a high-end Silicon Valley commercial park. The bait is meticulously tailored for a megalomaniac like Richard Thorn. Apex sends a formal letter of intent to the Thorn Auto Empire headquarters in Chicago. The offer is staggering: a $100 million all-cash buyout of their entire dealership network. The trap is baited with a single irresistible condition. Apex requires an expedited closing within 14 days, supposedly, to align with the end of their fiscal quarter. It is the perfect lifeline for a company secretly drowning in debt disguised as a once-in-a-lifetime golden ticket. Back in Chicago, the reaction is predictable and instantaneous. Marcus intercepts their internal corporate communications through legally obtained surveillance channels authorized during Harrison's initial fraud investigation. The audio feeds from the Thorn boardroom paint a pathetic picture. Richard and Jamal do not question the sudden windfall. They do not pause to wonder why a massive California investment firm is suddenly interested in a Midwestern car dealership. Their arrogance completely blinds them to the danger. They open vintage champagne in their executive suite, congratulating themselves on their unparalleled business acumen. Jamal convinces Richard that his risky offshore investments can be quietly buried in the acquisition paperwork, covered up by the massive influx of liquid cash. They believe they have successfully scammed a group of tech billionaires. The perceived victory supercharges the family's cruelty. Vanessa, high on the promise of impending wealth, takes to social media. She posts a barrage of stories from luxury boutiques on the Magnificent Mile, posing with armfuls of designer shopping bags. Her captions read, $100 million heiress loading and upgrading the empire, while the trash takes itself out. Her followers shower her with praise, completely oblivious to the impending collapse. Patricia decides to join the harassment campaign. My new secure phone vibrates on the glass desk. An unsaved number pops up, but the malicious tone is unmistakable. Patricia sends a photograph of a crowded, rundown homeless shelter in downtown Chicago. Her accompanying text reads, "Maybe our new billionaire friends can donate a cot for you. Hope you are enjoying the consequences of your jealousy." I look at the image of the shelter, the harsh fluorescent lights, and the desperate people waiting in line. A week ago, a message like this from my adoptive mother would have sent me spiraling into a deep depression. I would have internalized the abuse, convinced that I somehow deserved their venom. But sitting beside Harrison Cole, armed with the undeniable truth of my own worth and their profound criminality, the text message is nothing more than a pathetic echo of a dying regime. I do not block the number. I do not reply with anger. I simply read the message, set the phone face down on the desk, and smile. Their cruelty is no longer a weapon. It is fuel. The trap enters its final, most critical phase. To finalize the $100 million acquisition, Apex Ventures formally requests a comprehensive review of the Thorn dealership's financial ledgers. This is the exact moment Jamal has to make a fatal choice. Submitting the real, unedited balance sheets will immediately expose his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses and the illegal leveraging of dealership assets. The buyout would be instantly canceled, and Richard would discover that his golden son-in-law has bankrupted the family. Alternatively, Jamal can doctor the financial records, inflating profits, hiding the offshore liabilities, and presenting a fabricated picture of financial health to the buyers. Driven by desperation and unchecked hubris, Jamal chooses the latter. Sitting in his luxurious Chicago office, he systematically alters 5 years of corporate tax returns and balance sheets. He erases the massive debts and paints a masterpiece of financial fiction. Then he makes the final irrevocable mistake. He attaches the forged documents to an email and transmits them from his server in Illinois to the Apex Ventures server in California. In Harrison's office, Marcus watches the digital transfer complete. The progress bar hits 100%, and a green confirmation message flashes across the massive wall monitor. Marcus turns to us, closing his laptop with a sharp, satisfying snap. He crossed state lines, Marcus announces, his voice ringing with absolute finality. By transmitting intentionally falsified financial documents across state borders to secure capital, Jamal Thorn has just committed federal wire fraud. We have the digital footprint, the IP logs, and the original metadata. It is a textbook federal offense carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. Harrison stands up, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket. He looks at me, his blue eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. "The trap is sprung," he says quietly. "They have handed us the rope. Now we pull it tight." I pick up my phone and open my text messages. I navigate to the group chat that Richard, Patricia, Vanessa, and Jamal still use to coordinate their attacks against me. The closing ceremony for the Apex acquisition is scheduled for the following evening at the Ritz-Carlton. They are planning a massive public celebration of their ultimate victory. I type my final message to them, ensuring every single word drips with terrifying composure. "Good luck with the signing tomorrow. I hear the paperwork is killer." I hit send, slip the phone into my pocket, and stand up to join my father. It is time to fly back to Chicago. We leave the high-tech fortress of Apex Ventures and head straight to a private tailor in San Francisco. If I am going to dismantle the Thorn empire in front of the city's elite, I will not do it wearing the soaked, ruined dress they threw me out in. I am fitted for a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. As I look at myself in the full-length mirror, the transformation is absolute. The bruised, discarded girl is entirely gone. The architect of their destruction is staring back. The flight back to Chicago feels completely different than the journey out. We are not fleeing. We are hunting. As the private jet descended through the thick cloud cover over Chicago, the sprawling grid of city lights stretched out below us like a glowing map. I stared down at the illuminated streets, and the sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me again, striking harder than a freight train. For 33 years, I had walked those streets believing I owed the Thorne family an unpayable debt. I had swallowed their insults, accepted their leftover clothes, and bowed my head when they called me a useless burden. They had conditioned me to feel small, worthless, and endlessly grateful for the crumbs they tossed my way. But as I looked at the digital copies of the bank statements glowing on the tablet in my lap, the absolute truth crystallized into a weapon. I was never a charity case. I was the silent, unknowing architect of their entire lavish lifestyle. Every single luxury car Richard flaunted in his television commercials, the sprawling mansion where Patricia hosted her elite bridge club, the private university tuition that paved Vanessa's way to corporate management, and the massive bonuses Jamal used to buy his designer suits. All of it was paid for with my mother's blood money. They had built a glittering empire on the grave of my true family. They had stolen $5 million meant for a grieving 5-year-old girl and used it to fund their boundless arrogance. I thought about the nights I had eaten instant noodles in a freezing apartment while trying to build my freelance business, completely unaware that millions of dollars belonging to me were sitting in offshore accounts controlled by Jamal. The realization burned away the last lingering traces of the terrified girl I used to be. The tears I had shed on the cold marble floor of their mansion felt like they belonged to a naive stranger. In their place, a cold, crystalline clarity settled deeply into my bones. Across the aisle, Harrison swirled a glass of neat bourbon. Despite the flawless execution of our corporate trap, I could see the raw, volatile anger still churning behind his bright blue eyes. He set his glass down on the polished wood table and leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "We do not have to wait for the gala tomorrow night," Harrison said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "My legal team has the wire fraud evidence fully authenticated. I can make one phone call right now. We can have a dozen federal agents waiting on the tarmac when we land. We can have Richard and Jamal dragged out of their beds in handcuffs tonight. They will be locked in a federal holding cell before midnight. I can make sure they never see the outside of a prison again." He wanted the immediate, brutal justice of the legal system. He wanted to strip them of their freedom, instantly punishing them for stealing his daughter and erasing his late wife's legacy. He described exactly how the federal prosecutors would freeze their assets by morning, leaving Patricia and Vanessa stranded without a single dime, completely confused and terrified. It was a tempting, clean, and devastatingly efficient plan. Harrison possessed the wealth and influence to crush the Thorne family with a single phone call, wrapping up a 28-year nightmare before the sun came up. I looked away from the window and met my father's intense gaze. I reached out and gently placed my hand over his. "No," I said, my voice projecting absolute, unshakable certainty. "Arresting them in the middle of the night is too easy. It gives Richard a convenient escape route. It allows him to wake up in a jail cell and play the victim. He will spin a narrative to his expensive lawyers that he was ambushed, that this is a giant corporate misunderstanding, that he is a persecuted, self-made businessman." I picked up the tablet, swiping through the fraudulent balance sheets Jamal had transmitted to our dummy corporation. "Richard Thorne is a raging narcissist." I continued, feeling the strategy lock perfectly into place in my mind. His entire existence, his inflated ego, his profound sense of superiority, it all relies completely on public perception. If we just throw him in prison privately, he maintains his grand delusion. I want him to lose everything he built with my mother's money right when he thinks he is at the absolute top. I want him standing on a stage surrounded by the media, his fierce rivals, and the high society elite he worships. I want him to feel the exact moment his legacy shatters into a million pieces. Harrison watched me, listening intently as I laid out the final strokes of the execution. "We let them host the gala," I said, my tone hardening. "We let them put on their expensive suits and drink their vintage champagne. We let them stand at the podium and brag about their $100 million acquisition to everyone they know. And right when Richard reaches for the pen to sign the paperwork, right when he believes he has successfully scammed his way out of bankruptcy and secured his family's wealth forever, that is when we strike. We take his pride, his money, and his freedom all at once. Harrison's posture relaxed slightly, a grim, highly satisfied smile replacing his earlier tension. He understood perfectly. A quiet arrest was justice for the state, but a public humiliating annihilation was ultimate justice for me. The private jet touched down smoothly on the runway at Chicago O'Hare. A fleet of black vehicles was already waiting for us on the damp tarmac. As we descended the stairs into the chilly night air, I felt no fear whatsoever. I felt no hesitation. I slipped into the back of the lead vehicle alongside Harrison, while our heavily armed security detail and the federal agents who had been coordinating with our legal team filled the surrounding cars. We drove through the illuminated streets of the city, heading straight toward the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Every block we passed felt like a reclamation of my stolen past. I looked down at the custom-tailored charcoal suit I was wearing. It felt like impenetrable armor. I checked my secure phone one last time. The tracking software indicated that Richard, Patricia, Vanessa, and Jamal were already inside the grand ballroom, greeting their guests completely oblivious to the Category 5 hurricane heading straight for their front door. They thought they were about to secure a $100 million buyout. They thought they had finally disposed of the family embarrassment forever. They had absolutely no idea that the girl they threw out into the freezing rain was about to walk through those doors and burn their entire world to ash. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrison Cole's Silicon Valley headquarters. I sat at a sleek glass conference table, a fresh cup of coffee warming my hands. The storm of yesterday was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. I looked down at the secure smartphone Harrison's security team had provided me. It was time to make the first move. I needed to see exactly how they would react when their carefully constructed lie was threatened. I tapped the screen and dialed the number I had been conditioned to fear my entire life. Patricia answered on the third ring. The background noise suggested she was at her exclusive country club, likely having brunch with her wealthy friends. "Hello, Patricia," said her voice dripping with that familiar condescending tone. "If you are calling to apologize for ruining your father's birthday, you are wasting your time. You are completely cut off, Natalie. Do not expect another dime from us." I did not flinch. A day ago, that threat would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. Now it was just pathetic. "I am not calling for an apology, Patricia," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "I am calling because I need my paperwork. I want my original adoption records. Specifically, I need the unredacted files from 1998, the ones filed right before the transfer of the $5 million trust. Have them sent to my email by noon." The line went dead silent. The background clatter of the country club seemed to vanish. I could practically hear the blood draining from Patricia's face. The arrogant matriarch of the Thorne family was suddenly confronted with a ghost she thought she had buried 28 years ago. "What are you talking about?" Patricia stammered, her voice cracking. Her confident facade shattered instantly. "There is no trust. You are delusional. You have always been unstable. Do not play games with me," I said, my voice hardening into a sharp blade. "I know about the accident. I know about the forged paperwork. I know exactly what Richard did. Have the files in my inbox by noon, or my next call is to the federal authorities." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the glass desk. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bait was set. 2,000 miles away in Chicago, sheer panic erupted. According to the communication logs Harrison's team later intercepted. Patricia completely abandoned her brunch. She sprinted to her car and frantically dialed Richard. Richard was standing on the showroom floor of his flagship dealership, schmoozing with a high-profile client when his phone rang. Upon hearing Patricia's hysterical voice, babbling about the 1998 adoption records and the trust fund, Richard bolted to the executive suites, locking the door behind him. He immediately summoned Jamal. Jamal strode into the office, his usual arrogant swagger quickly vanishing when he saw the sheer terror on his father-in-law's face. Richard explained the phone call. Jamal realized the catastrophic danger they were in. If Natalie dug into the adoption record, she would inevitably find the paper trail leading to the trust fund. If she found the trust fund, she would discover the millions of dollars Jamal had illegally funneled into his disastrous offshore investments. Their entire empire, their freedom, and their lavish lifestyle would be incinerated. "We have to crush her right now," Jamal told Richard, pacing the length of the executive office. "We have to cut off every single resource she has. If she cannot afford a lawyer, she cannot file a lawsuit. If she cannot buy food, she will come crawling back and beg for forgiveness. I will starve her out." Jamal sprinted back to his own office and locked the door. As the chief financial officer of the Thorn Auto Empire, he wielded massive leverage in the regional banking sector. He moved millions of dollars through local banks every month, making him a highly valued client. He picked up his desk phone and bypassed standard customer service, dialing the direct cell phone number of a corrupt vice president at the bank, where I held all my personal and business accounts. Jamal did not hesitate to completely fabricate a story. He told the banking executive that I had gone rogue, claiming I had stolen proprietary financial data from the Thorn dealerships and was attempting to funnel embezzled funds through my personal accounts. He invoked emergency corporate protection protocols, demanding an immediate total freeze on my assets to prevent capital flight. The banker, eager to please a major corporate client and bypass federal red tape, complied without asking a single question. Back in California, I was sitting at a workstation in Harrison's office, preparing to pay one of my freelance developers for a completed project. I logged into my banking portal, typed in my password, and pressed enter. The screen did not load my dashboard. Instead, the page flashed a harsh, glaring red. A massive warning banner completely blocked my access. The text read, "Account frozen. Please contact your branch manager immediately regarding suspected fraudulent activity." I frowned and tried to access my separate business checking account. Frozen. I checked my digital savings. Locked. I pulled a credit card from my wallet and tried to process a $1 test transaction. Declined. In less than 20 minutes, Jamal had weaponized his corporate power to completely sever me from my own money. Every single dollar I had earned through years of grueling late-night freelance work was locked behind a digital wall. I was financially paralyzed. I stared at the red warning screens, understanding the sheer ruthlessness of their strategy. They believed I was sitting in a cheap Chicago apartment completely alone, realizing I could not even buy a cup of coffee. They wanted me terrified. They wanted me broken. My secure smartphone buzzed on the desk, vibrating loudly against the glass. I picked it up. A new text message illuminated the screen. It was from Jamal. He could not resist gloating. He needed to make sure I knew exactly who held the power. The message was short, vicious, and entirely unrepentant. "You bite the hand that feeds you, you starve. Good luck buying lunch today." I read the words twice. A week ago, this targeted financial attack would have sent me into a blinding panic attack. I would have been crying on the floor, hyperventilating, convinced my life was over. I would have drafted a desperate apology text begging them to release my funds. But as I sat in the immaculate high-tech fortress of a billionaire venture capitalist, flanked by a team of elite corporate lawyers and forensic accountants, Jamal's threat was nothing more than a pathetic joke. I did not panic. I did not cry. I simply locked the phone screen, turned to Harrison, and showed him the message. The countermove had worked perfectly. They had revealed their true nature, and now we had the justification to destroy them completely. The countermove had worked perfectly. They had revealed their true nature, and now we had the justification to destroy them completely. But the Thorn family was not done. Freezing my bank accounts was merely Jamal's way of establishing dominance. Vanessa, however, wanted blood. My sister had always viewed my independence as a personal insult. To her, my ability to survive without Richard's money was a constant irritating reminder that her own entire existence was subsidized by a man she desperately feared. Now that the gloves were off, Vanessa intended to make sure I could never work in the tech industry again. While I sat in the secure high-tech fortress of my biological father, my professional laptop began to chime. It started as a single sharp notification, an email from the director of operations at a major health tech startup based in Chicago. I had spent the last 3 weeks negotiating a lucrative user interface redesign for their upcoming mobile application. The contract was scheduled to be signed by the end of the business day. I clicked open the message, expecting the final draft. Instead, I found a harsh 2-line cancellation. The director stated that due to newly acquired information regarding my professional integrity, they were terminating all negotiations immediately and requested I delete all proprietary files I had received during the consultation phase. I frowned, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Before I could process the sudden rejection, a second chime echoed through the quiet office. Then a third. Then a rapid, relentless cascade of notification sounds flooded the room. I opened my primary email client, watching in absolute disbelief as my inbox transformed into a graveyard. A prominent financial technology firm sent a formal notice severing our retaining contract. A national retail chain demanded an immediate halt to all ongoing website development. An educational software company I had worked with for 2 years sent a legally threatening message demanding I return all advance payments. The destruction was systematic, brutal, and breathtakingly fast. I opened the message from the fintech firm and scrolled down to find a forwarded attachment. The source of the devastation stared back at me in bold, arrogant letters. It was an email from Vanessa, sent using the official, highly respected corporate letterhead of the Thorn Auto empire. She had attached an urgent, high-priority red flag warning to every single client listed on my professional portfolio website. The sheer scale of the slander was staggering. Vanessa had crafted a masterclass in corporate character assassination. In the email, she falsely identified herself as my former corporate supervisor. She claimed that I had recently been terminated from a senior contract position at the Thorn dealership network for severe malicious data theft. She fabricated a horrifying narrative telling my clients that I had utilized my back-end access to steal highly sensitive customer financial records, internal credit reports, and proprietary sales algorithms. But Vanessa did not stop at simple theft. To ensure my complete and absolute ruin, she escalated the lie to the federal level. She wrote that I was currently the prime suspect in an active, ongoing investigation by federal trade regulators and cybercrime units. She explicitly warned my clients that continuing to employ my services would put their own corporate networks at extreme risk of federal subpoenas and data confiscation. It was a lethal corporate strike. In the hyper-cautious world of software development and user experience design, the mere whisper of data theft was a death sentence. No company, regardless of our past working history, was going to risk a federal data breach investigation to protect a freelance designer. They severed ties immediately, ruthlessly, and without asking for my side of the story. I sat perfectly still, the blue light of the laptop screen reflecting off my face. In the span of 4 hours, Vanessa had systematically hunted down and slaughtered the career I had spent 5 agonizing years building. I remembered the grueling years I had endured after Richard and Patricia first cast me aside. I remembered working a cashier job until midnight, then forcing my exhausted eyes to stay open until 4 in the morning to learn advanced coding and design principles from free online tutorials. I remembered surviving on cheap pasta and tap water just to afford the server hosting fees for my first digital portfolio. Every client I had won was a victory fought tooth and nail against a world that told me I was nothing. My career was the only thing I owned that was entirely mine, and with a single fabricated email, Vanessa had burned it all to ash. My secure smartphone buzzed on the glass desk. A new message illuminated the screen. It was Vanessa. She could not resist the urge to admire her own destruction. She needed to make sure I was watching the flames. "Go back to the gutter where you belong," her message read. "Go against the thorns, and you will not survive in this city. You are nothing without us, and now you have the bank balance and the reputation to prove it." Harrison watched me from across the room. He had seen the notifications pouring in. He had read the forwarded email from Vanessa. His hands were clenched into tight fists, his knuckles turning white as a dangerous protective fury radiated from his posture. He reached for his desk phone, entirely prepared to unleash a small army of corporate defamation lawyers to rip Vanessa's life apart by sundown. I raised my hand, stopping him. I did not shed a single tear. A week ago, losing my livelihood would have shattered me into a million irreparable pieces. I would have felt the crushing weight of absolute defeat. I would have believed Vanessa's words, convinced that I truly was a worthless failure who could not survive on her own. But as I stared at the vicious text message, a profound icy calm washed over my entire body. They were attacking a phantom. They were pouring all their energy, all their malice, and all their corporate leverage into destroying a struggling freelance designer who had ceased to exist the moment I stepped into this billionaire's sanctuary. They thought they were crushing an ant, completely blind to the fact that they were standing directly in the path of an avalanche. "Let them celebrate," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, hollow certainty that made even Harrison pause. "Let Vanessa think she is a genius. Let Jamal think he is untouchable. When arrogant people believe they have already won the war, they stop looking for traps." I closed my laptop, shutting away the graveyard of my former career. The loss of my freelance clients did not matter anymore. I was not playing a game of simple retaliation. I was preparing to dismantle the very foundation of their existence. Every vicious lie Vanessa told, every dollar Jamal froze, and every drop of blood Richard drew from my cheek only sharpened the blade I was preparing to drive straight through the heart of their empire. I picked up my phone. I did not hurl insults back at my sister. I did not beg her to retract her emails. I simply locked the screen and set it aside. The battlefield was set, and their overconfidence was exactly the weapon I needed to initiate the final devastating phase of my plan. I turned my gaze from the silenced phone back to the expansive glass monitors dominating Harrison Cole's high-security office. The room was a marvel of Silicon Valley engineering, entirely soundproofed and detached from the main corporate grid to ensure absolute privacy for venture capital acquisitions. It was the perfect war room. My phone screen lit up once more, breaking the quiet hum of the server towers. Vanessa was relentlessly pushing her advantage, intoxicated by her perceived victory over my career and finances. The notification banner displayed her final attempt to break my spirit. She wrote, "Go back to the gutter where you belong. Go against the thorns and you will not survive in this city. You are nothing without us, and now you have the bank balance and the reputation to prove it." She even attached a mocking image of a cardboard box sitting in a filthy alleyway. I looked at the malicious message, feeling a profound, almost clinical detachment. The high-altitude air of California, the secure environment of the office, the protective presence of my biological father sitting across from me, it all reinforced an unbreakable fortress of calm around my mind. Yesterday, an attack of this magnitude from my sister would have sent me spiraling into a severe panic attack. I would have internalized the abuse, convinced that I truly was the worthless failure they constantly claimed I was. I would have believed that my survival was entirely dependent on their meager generosity. But today, armed with the absolute truth of my identity and the reality of their crimes, I did not panic. I did not feel the crushing weight of anxiety that usually accompanied my family's psychological warfare. Instead, I simply swiped the notification away. I sat upright, adjusting the cuffs of the cashmere sweater Harrison's staff had provided, and refocused my attention on the massive digital displays covering the wall. I refused to react to her provocations. Harrison gestured to Marcus, his lead forensic accountant, who had been quietly working at a separate encrypted terminal. "Show us the blood," Harrison commanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble that echoed in the spacious office. Marcus nodded sharply and keyed a sequence of commands into his system. The entire wall of monitors shifted from a dark neutral screensaver to a blinding array of complex spreadsheets, debt graphs, liability charts, and offshore holding structures. Marcus had entirely bypassed the public sanitized financial reports that Jamal Thorne proudly submitted to the Chicago business bureaus. Instead, utilizing highly legal corporate backdoor inquiries and proprietary venture capital surveillance software, Marcus had meticulously unearthed the genuine financial architecture of the Thorne luxury auto empire. The picture painted on the glowing screens was catastrophic. Richard Thorne loved to project the image of an untouchable self-made billionaire. He spent fortunes airing television commercials where he stood proudly in front of fleets of imported European sports cars, bragging about record-breaking sales quarters. Patricia regularly flaunted this fabricated wealth at her exclusive country club, while Vanessa and Jamal lived like royalty on the company dime. But the reality displayed before us was a decaying hollow shell entirely propped up by financial illusions. The charts showed a staggering reality. Jamal, desperate to maintain the illusion of infinite wealth and desperately trying to prove his own financial genius to Richard, had been illegally leveraging the physical assets of the dealerships. He had taken out massive high-interest shadow loans, using the corporate real estate, the inventory, and even the employee pension funds as collateral. And he had not reinvested a single dollar of that money back into the legitimate business. He had funneled it all into highly volatile, unregulated offshore real estate markets and absolute junk cryptocurrency portfolios chasing massive returns that never materialized. They are hemorrhaging cash at an unprecedented fatal rate, Marcus explained, using a laser pointer to highlight a steeply declining red line on the central monitor. The cryptocurrency market corrected hard last month, completely wiping out Jamal's primary offshore hedge. The commercial lenders are already circling the perimeter. According to our most conservative projections, the Thorne Empire has exactly 60 days before they absolutely default on their primary operational loans. When that happens, the banks will instantly trigger the covenant, seize all physical inventory, and shutter every single dealership in the tri-state area. They are walking corpses, entirely bankrupt, but too arrogant to realize they are already dead. Harrison stood up, pacing slowly toward the screens, his blue eyes tracing the digital paths of stolen money. They built this entire illusion using your mother's $5 million, Natalie. And Richard's blind arrogance allowed his son-in-law to gamble every last cent of it away. They are backed into a terrifying corner, drowning in toxic debt, desperately searching for a miracle to bail them out before the federal auditors notice the massive, glaring holes in their ledgers. I absorbed the data, letting the absolute scale of their vulnerability wash over me completely. Vanessa was busy laughing at my frozen bank accounts, completely oblivious to the fact that her own husband had essentially bankrupted their family legacy. Jamal was acting like an untouchable corporate titan while actively committing massive federal financial crimes to hide his failures. They were projecting absolute strength while standing on rapidly sinking quicksand. This was not just an opportunity for simple revenge, it was the perfect, flawless setup for a total public annihilation. We did not need to attack them directly with lawyers or police right now. We simply needed to offer them a lifeline, a golden parachute that looked exactly like the salvation they were desperately praying for, and then rip it away at the absolute highest possible altitude. I picked up my secure phone from the glass desk. Vanessa's cruel, mocking message was still visible on the screen. She wanted me to feel utterly small. She wanted me to feel utterly defeated and terrified of their power. I unlocked the device and opened our text thread. I did not mention my frozen bank accounts. I did not mention her slanderous career-ruining emails to my freelance clients. I did not let a single ounce of anger, fear, or hesitation bleed into my response. I typed a single calculated sentence designed to plant a tiny invisible seed of dread in the very back of her mind, a sentence she would not fully understand until it was far too late to save herself. I hope your balance sheets are accurate. I hit send, watched the message deliver, placed the phone face down on the desk, and turned back to the glowing monitors. It is time to set the trap, I told Harrison, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. Let us buy a car dealership. Harrison nodded sharply, a predatory glint illuminating his blue eyes. He turned his attention back to his lead forensic accountant, raising a single hand to issue the command that would initiate the total financial dismantling of the Thorne family. He told Bradley to deploy the full force of their forensic accounting division. Within minutes, the glass conference room transformed into a high-stakes digital war room. A dozen elite financial analysts, the very best minds Silicon Valley venture capital had to offer, quietly filed into the space-opening encrypted laptops and syncing their feeds to the massive wall monitors. They did not rely on the sanitized, heavily manipulated quarterly reports that Jamal proudly submitted to the Chicago business bureaus. Those documents were nothing but glossy marketing brochures filled with fabricated revenue projections and inflated inventory valuations. Instead, Harrison's team utilized aggressive, highly classified corporate surveillance protocols to trace the actual flow of capital moving in and out of the Thorn Auto empire. I sat beside Harrison watching the screens light up with cascading rows of raw banking data, offshore wire transfers, and leveraged asset portfolios. Bradley directed his team with surgical precision, instructing them to pull apart every single ledger tax filing and commercial loan covenant tied to Richard Thorne. It took less than 3 hours for the facade of their billionaire lifestyle to completely disintegrate before my eyes. The truth, hidden beneath their expensive suits, country club memberships, and brand new Porsches, was absolutely pathetic. Bradley isolated a specific series of massive financial transactions on the central screen. He pointed to a web of complex corporate structures that all traced back to Jamal's personal authorization codes. Jamal Thorne was not a financial genius. He was an incredibly arrogant amateur, playing a wildly dangerous game of corporate roulette. Driven by a desperate need to impress Richard and prove his own superiority, Jamal had been systematically exploiting his position as chief financial officer. He had quietly taken out catastrophic high-interest shadow loans from predatory commercial lenders. To secure these massive lines of credit, he had illegally used the physical assets of the dealerships as collateral. He had mortgaged the dealership real estate, the vast lots of luxury vehicle inventory, and most sickening of all, the employee pension funds. Bradley tracked the stolen money as it washed through a series of anonymous shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Jamal had essentially embezzled the dealership's operating capital to fund his own delusional ambitions. He had sunk staggering amounts of cash into highly speculative offshore commercial real estate projects that had completely stalled due to regulatory issues. Worse yet, he had gambled the remaining millions on absolute junk cryptocurrency portfolios, chasing massive overnight returns to cover up his initial real estate losses. The timing could not have been worse for Jamal. The cryptocurrency market had experienced a brutal sudden crash just 3 weeks ago. The digital tokens Jamal had heavily invested in lost 90% of their value overnight. His primary offshore hedge was completely wiped out. He had effectively vaporized tens of millions of dollars of company cash, leaving the Thorn Auto empire standing on a massive gaping sinkhole of toxic debt. Bradley zoomed in on a specific commercial loan covenant, highlighted in harsh red text on the monitor. This was the fatal flaw in Jamal's desperate scheme. The primary lenders who had issued the shadow loans were scheduled to conduct a mandatory quarterly audit of their collateral in exactly 60 days. When those auditors arrived in Chicago and demanded to see the liquid cash reserves and unencumbered inventory, they would instantly discover the massive hole in the ledgers. The moment they realized the assets had been illegally double-leveraged, the banks would immediately declare a total default. Harrison crossed his arms, staring at the impending corporate death sentence displayed on the screen. The mechanics of their destruction were already in motion. In exactly 60 days, the commercial banks would instantly freeze all Thorne accounts, seize the dealership properties, padlock the showroom doors, and liquidate the luxury inventory to recoup their losses. Richard Thorne would be completely bankrupt, stripped of his entire empire in a matter of hours. The sheer magnitude of Jamal's incompetence was breathtaking. He had doomed the entire family, yet he spent his mornings laughing at my frozen bank accounts and sending me arrogant text messages. The forensic team also tapped into the metadata of the Thorne executive email servers. The intercepted communications painted a vivid picture of absolute blinding desperation inside the Chicago headquarters. Behind the locked mahogany doors of his executive suite, Richard was in a state of sheer panic. He did not know the full illegal extent of Jamal's offshore gambling, But he knew the company was bleeding cash at a fatal rate. He knew they could not make payroll for the next quarter. The intercepted emails showed Richard and Jamal frantically sending out blind, desperate inquiries to private equity firms, hedge funds, and independent investors across the country. They were begging for a massive capital injection. They needed an immediate, miraculous buyout to plug the multi-million-dollar hole before the banks initiated their audits, and the federal regulators noticed the discrepancies. They were terrified. They needed a buyer who was wealthy enough to drop an exorbitant amount of cash up front, but naive enough not to look too closely at the doctored financial ledgers Jamal was preparing. They were searching for a gullible billionaire to serve as their ultimate lifeline. I looked at the intercepted, panicked emails from Richard begging for meetings with investors. Then I looked down at the text message from Vanessa telling me to go back to the gutter where I belonged. Their hypocrisy was astounding. They projected absolute cruel dominance over me while secretly drowning in an ocean of their own financial ruin. They thought they were the apex predators of Chicago. They had absolutely no idea they were just bleeding bait in the water. I turned to Harrison, a cold, calculating resolve settling over my every thought. The strategy was flawless. We did not need to ruin them. We just needed to let them ruin themselves. We knew exactly what they desperately needed to survive, and we were going to be the ones to offer it to them. Harrison did not waste a single second. Within the hour, his private legal team began constructing the perfect digital mirage. They birthed a phantom entity named Apex Ventures, LLC. We needed this dummy corporation to look absolutely impenetrable, a towering monolith of West Coast wealth that would make a traditional Chicago businessman like Richard Thorne salivate. Harrison secured a premium lease for a shell office on the top floor of a prestigious commercial high-rise in Palo Alto. It was an empty suite with a stunning view staffed only by a sophisticated automated phone system, and a receptionist paid a premium to route all inquiries directly to our secure server farm. While the lawyers filed the expedited incorporation paperwork in Delaware, I utilized my design expertise to construct the firm's digital footprint. I built a sleek, minimalist website that screamed institutional power. I populated the site with vague but intimidating financial jargon, highlighting a fictitious portfolio of aggressive acquisitions and corporate restructuring. We appointed a board of directors composed entirely of untraceable proxy entities and specialized attorneys bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. To the outside world, Apex Ventures, LLC, was a ruthless, hungry venture capital firm looking to aggressively diversify its portfolio by snatching up legacy automotive assets in the Midwest. In reality, it was a finely tuned guillotine waiting for Richard to stick his neck inside. By the following morning, the trap was fully armed and ready to be deployed. Harrison instructed his most intimidating corporate acquisition lawyer, a man whose hourly rate could buy a sports car, to draft the formal letter of intent. We did not send an email. We wanted the presentation to feel heavy, undeniable, and dripping with arrogance. A private courier hand delivered a thick, gold-embossed envelope directly to the executive suite at the Thorne dealership headquarters in Chicago. The envelope was marked strictly confidential and required Richard's personal signature for release. The terms outlined in the document were designed to completely short-circuit Richard's critical thinking. Apex Ventures formally proposed a complete, unmitigated buyout of the entire Thorne auto empire. We offered to acquire the brand, the commercial real estate, the massive vehicle inventory, and all operational licenses. The purchase price was set at a staggering $100 million, and we offered to pay it entirely in liquid cash. It was an astronomical figure. It was more than enough to instantly wipe out the catastrophic offshore debts Jamal had secretly accumulated. It would cover the failing cryptocurrency margins, silence the predatory shadow lenders circling their assets, and still leave Richard stepping away as a ridiculously wealthy patriarch. We knew that staring at a 9-figure cash offer would activate the blinding greed that ruled both men. A drowning man does not inspect the texture of the life preserver thrown to him. He just grabs it with both hands. But a massive cash offer alone was not enough to spring the trap. We needed them to make a fatal mistake, and we needed them to do it on the federal record. That is where the hook came in. The letter of intent explicitly stated that Apex Ventures was currently restructuring its own tax liabilities before the close of the current fiscal quarter. Therefore, the $100 million buyout was strictly contingent upon an insanely expedited closing schedule. We gave the Thorne family exactly 14 days to sign the final transfer agreements. In the world of high-level corporate acquisitions, a 14-day closing window is practically impossible. Normal due diligence for a deal of this magnitude takes months of intense scrutiny, physical audits, and legal negotiations. But we intentionally weaponized their desperation. The letter made it perfectly clear that if the deadline was not met, Apex Ventures would instantly withdraw the offer and pivot to a rival dealership network in Ohio. We created a ticking clock that would deafen them to their own common sense. To meet this aggressive deadline, the Apex legal team required immediate full transparency. The contract demanded that the Thorne chief financial officer submit all internal balance sheets, unredacted corporate tax filings, and certified operational ledgers for the past 5 years directly to our California servers within 48 hours. This was the psychological choke point. Jamal was now staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. If he stalled or refused to provide the financial documents, Richard would lose the $100 million buyout and inevitably discover the catastrophic financial ruin Jamal had secretly caused. But if Jamal submitted the genuine, unedited ledgers, the Apex buyers would instantly see the illegal leveraging and the massive offshore debt. The deal would collapse, and Jamal would still face Richard's wrath. The expedited timeline stripped Jamal of his ability to maneuver. He had no time to secure secondary loans or invent a plausible cover story. He was trapped in a pressure cooker of his own making, forced to choose between immediate exposure or doubling down on his deception. We knew exactly what a cornered, arrogant man like Jamal would do. To secure the buyout and save his own skin, he would have to doctor the corporate books. He would have to systematically falsify the financial records, inflate the dealership profits, and entirely erase the toxic liabilities. And the moment he hit send on those fabricated documents, transmitting them from his office in Chicago to our dummy servers in California to secure a $100 million transaction, he would cross the threshold from simple corporate mismanagement into blatant, undeniable federal wire fraud. Sitting in the glow of the monitors in Harrison's office, we watched the digital tracking software monitor the delivery of the courier package in Chicago. The notification pinged on the screen, confirming that Richard Thorne had signed for the envelope. The bait was officially in their hands. All we had to do now was sit back, maintain absolute silence, and wait for their greed to override their survival instincts. The audio feeds from the Thorne boardroom painted a pathetic picture of men who believed their own lies. Through a compromised microphone array established by Harrison's cyber intelligence team, we listened in real time as Richard tore open the gold-embossed envelope. The heavy silence that followed lasted only 30 seconds before it was shattered by a sudden booming laugh. Richard's voice echoed through the encrypted audio feed, dripping with a sickening blend of relief and profound arrogance. He genuinely believed that his localized failing Midwestern car empire had organically attracted the attention of elite West Coast venture capitalists. "Call Jamal up here immediately," Richard barked at his secretary over the intercom. "Tell him to bring the vintage Dom Perignon from my private reserve." When Jamal entered the boardroom, the audio picked up the sharp, distinct pop of a champagne cork, hitting the vaulted ceiling. Richard poured the drinks, launching into a grandiose, self-congratulatory speech. He paced the length of his office, loudly proclaiming that his business acumen was unparalleled. He boasted that these Silicon Valley tech billionaires were desperate for tangible legacy assets and were willing to overpay just to acquire the Thorne brand name. He claimed this was the ultimate validation of his life's work. Jamal played his part perfectly, though Marcus's visual surveillance data from the building's internal security cameras painted a slightly different picture. As Richard toasted to their imminent 9-figure windfall, Jamal was physically sweating. He gripped his crystal flute so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Jamal knew the company was drowning in the toxic offshore debt he had created. He knew the commercial lenders were preparing to seize their assets within 60 days. But instead of confessing his catastrophic failures, Jamal looked at the $100 million buyout as his divine salvation. He clinked his glass against Richard's, a massive fabricated smile plastered across his face. "We can meet their expedited closing schedule," Jamal assured his father-in-law, his voice dripping with false confidence. "I will have the entire 5-year financial ledger compiled and transmitted to their servers by tomorrow night. Consider it a done deal." Listening from the Palo Alto fortress, I watched the audio waveforms spike on the monitor. Jamal had just committed to his own execution. To meet that deadline and secure the cash, he had no choice but to sit down and actively doctor the balance sheets. He was going to wipe out the cryptocurrency losses, inflate their liquid reserves, and digitally erase the massive shadow loans. The sheer arrogance required to attempt a fraud of that magnitude against a supposedly elite investment firm was staggering. They thought they were the smartest men in the room, utterly blind to the fact that they were dancing inside a slaughterhouse. The intoxicating promise of $100 million quickly infected the rest of the Thorne family. Richard could not keep his mouth shut. He immediately informed his wife and daughter that their wealth was about to skyrocket into the stratosphere. Within hours, Vanessa mobilized to capitalize on the imaginary windfall. Our cyber team monitored her public digital footprint, watching a spectacular display of unhinged consumerism unfold across her social media platforms. Vanessa treated the unsigned letter of intent as a blank check. She stormed the luxury boutiques lining Chicago's Magnificent Mile. Harrison's monitors displayed real-time updates as Vanessa posted dozens of photos to her hundreds of thousands of followers. There was an image of her standing in a VIP fitting room, surrounded by towering stacks of Chanel and Cartier shopping bags. Another video showed her drinking mimosas while test driving a custom G-Wagon she planned to purchase for herself. The crowning jewel of her delusion was a highly filtered, carefully staged photograph of her raising a diamond-encrusted champagne flute. The caption beneath the image was a masterclass in tone-deaf vanity. It read, $100 million heiress loading, upgrading the empire while the trash takes itself out. She was publicly spending money that did not exist, drawn from a dummy corporation created by the very sister she was mocking. She was practically printing the evidence of her own shallow materialistic greed for the entire internet to witness. I watched the likes and congratulatory comments flood her feed. I felt absolutely no anger toward her. I only felt a profound, chilling pity. The higher she climbed her pedestal of fabricated wealth, the more devastating the impact would be when gravity finally took hold. But Vanessa was not the only one eager to twist the knife. Patricia, emboldened by the guarantee of limitless upcoming wealth, decided to launch a direct, highly personal attack. She wanted to ensure I was thoroughly crushed, completely defeated, and fully aware of how magnificently my adoptive family was thriving without me. My secure smartphone buzzed loudly against the glass surface of the conference table. I glanced down. An unsaved Chicago area code flashed on the screen, but the toxic, vindictive energy practically radiated from the device. I opened the message. Patricia had not sent a wall of text. She had sent a single high-resolution photograph. It was an image of a bleak, overcrowded homeless shelter located in the worst district of downtown Chicago. The picture highlighted a line of desperate, freezing people wrapped in tattered blankets waiting to get inside for a hot meal. Beneath the grim photograph, Patricia had attached a brief, incredibly cruel message. "Maybe our new billionaire friends can donate a cot for you. I hope you enjoy the consequences of your jealousy. Enjoy the gutter." I sat perfectly still, the harsh blue light of the phone screen reflecting in my eyes. I read the words again, letting the sheer, unadulterated malice of the woman who raised me wash over my mind. A lifetime ago, an attack this vicious would have broken me. I would have internalized the abuse, convinced that I was inherently flawed and deserving of their absolute contempt. I would have cried until my lungs burned. But sitting here flanked by my biological father and a team of the sharpest legal minds on the West Coast, the message held zero power. It was a fascinating artifact of a dying regime. I did not block the number. I did not type out a furious reply demanding respect. I did not flinch. I simply read the text message, placed the phone face down on the table, and smiled. It was a cold, quiet smile that did not reach my eyes. Harrison looked over from his workstation, noticing the shift in my demeanor. He raised a questioning eyebrow. I slid the phone across the smooth glass surface toward him. He picked it up, his eyes scanning Patricia's horrific message. His jaw tightened instantly, a protective, lethal fury flaring in his posture. "They are celebrating," I told him, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "They are popping vintage champagne, buying diamonds, and measuring me for a coffin. They have swallowed the hook completely." Harrison set the phone down, returning my cold smile with a predatory grin of his own. "The trap is locked," he confirmed softly. "Now we just wait for Jamal to hand us the murder weapon." The digital clock on the wall of the Chicago dealership headquarters read 2 in the morning. Through the surveillance feeds, we watched Jamal Thorne sitting alone in his sprawling executive office. The heavy mahogany door was locked from the inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh, sterile glow of 3 massive computer monitors. Jamal wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his usually immaculate designer tie hanging loose around his collar. The pressure of the 14-day closing window we had engineered was slowly crushing the air out of his lungs. To secure the $100 million lifeline from Apex Ventures, Jamal had to submit 5 years of certified operational ledgers and unredacted corporate tax filings. He opened the true financial database of the Thorne Auto Empire, and the screens immediately filled with catastrophic red ink. The reality of his absolute incompetence stared back at him. The massive shadow loans, the illegal leveraging of the employee pension funds, the completely vaporized offshore cryptocurrency portfolios. It was a digital graveyard of toxic debt. If he submitted these genuine files to our California servers, the acquisition would instantly evaporate. The commercial banks would initiate their audits, the dealerships would be seized, and Richard would publicly crucify him before throwing him to the authorities. Jamal took a deep, shuddering breath. Driven by blind arrogance and sheer desperation, he opened a blank duplicate database. He began to manually rewrite the financial history of the entire corporation. We watched in real time as Jamal systematically committed massive, undeniable federal crimes. His fingers flew across the keyboard, fabricating a masterpiece of corporate fiction. He digitally erased the high-interest commercial loans that were threatening to drown them. He aggressively inflated the value of the physical dealership inventory, turning depreciating assets into glowing profit margins. He completely wiped away any trace of the Cayman Islands shell companies and the disastrous real estate ventures. In their place, he inserted falsified revenue streams and phantom cash reserves, making the rotting Thorne empire appear like a highly lucrative, unstoppable juggernaut. It took him 7 agonizing hours of relentless data manipulation to sanitize the books. As the sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline, Jamal sat back in his leather chair, staring at his forged masterpiece. He genuinely believed he was a financial genius. He believed he had successfully outsmarted a team of elite Silicon Valley venture capitalists. He thought he was single-handedly saving the Thorne legacy and cementing his untouchable status as Richard's golden son-in-law. He leaned forward, highlighted the massive, highly encrypted folders containing the doctored financial ledgers, and attached them to a direct email addressed to the Apex Ventures due diligence portal. Jamal moved his cursor over the send button. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before clicking his mouse. 2,000 miles away in Palo Alto, a sharp, crisp chime echoed through Harrison Cole's soundproof office. Marcus, the lead forensic accountant, sat straight up in his chair. The progress bar on his central monitor filled rapidly as the encrypted payload from Chicago breached our secure servers. The download completed with a definitive green flash. Marcus opened the files and immediately launched a side-by-side analytical comparison. On the left side of the massive wall monitor, the genuine bleeding financial reality of the Thorne empire was displayed. On the right side, Jamal's freshly submitted, completely fabricated ledgers appeared. The software instantly highlighted the discrepancies in bright neon yellow. The screen practically glowed with thousands of deliberate, malicious alterations. "We have it," Marcus announced, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. The forensic software confirms a total systemic manipulation of their gross assets and hidden liabilities. He intentionally scrubbed the offshore debts, and inflated their operational capital by nearly $40 million. Harrison stood up, walking slowly toward the glowing monitors. His eyes locked onto the digital signature attached to the bottom of the transmission log. He sent this directly from his corporate IP address in Illinois to our registered servers here in California, Harrison stated, looking over at his lead corporate attorney. The attorney nodded, a cold, predatory smile forming on his face. By voluntarily and intentionally transmitting knowingly falsified financial documents across state lines for the explicit purpose of securing capital, Jamal Thorne has just executed a textbook case of federal wire fraud. This is not a civil dispute anymore. This is a severe federal offense carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. We have the metadata, the original files, and the forged submissions. The evidence is entirely irrefutable. The trap had officially snapped shut. Jamal had handed us the absolute power to dismantle his life, Richard's freedom, and the entire Thorne legacy in one single devastating stroke. They were no longer just arrogant bullies who had stolen my mother's money. They were documented federal criminals blindly walking onto a public stage. The final 24 hours before the closing gala moved with breathtaking speed. In Chicago, the Thorne family was entirely consumed by their own vanity. Intercepted communications showed Richard finalizing his arrogant victory speech, completely convinced he was cementing his status as a legendary business titan. Vanessa was actively coordinating with luxury event planners, ensuring the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom was draped in expensive floral arrangements and premium champagne towers for the signing ceremony. They were preparing for the greatest celebration of their lives, eagerly waiting for the mysterious CEO of Apex Ventures to arrive and hand them $100 million. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrison's office, looking out at the California sunset. The private jet was fueled and waiting on the tarmac to take us back to Chicago. I pulled my secure smartphone from my pocket. I navigated to the group chat that Patricia, Vanessa, Richard, and Jamal still used to mock me. I scrolled past the image of the homeless shelter Patricia had sent. I ignored the vicious insults from Vanessa. I focused entirely on Jamal's contact profile. He thought he had starved me out. He thought he had crushed my spirit and secured his own golden future. I wanted to plant a single tiny seed of psychological terror in his mind just hours before his entire world collapsed. I wanted him to read my words and feel a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine. I opened the keyboard and typed a precise, calculated message. "Good luck with the signing tomorrow. I hear the paperwork is killer." I pressed send and watched the delivery confirmation appear on the screen. I did not wait for a reply. I powered the device down completely, slipping it into the pocket of my newly tailored charcoal suit. I turned away from the window and walked toward the office door where Harrison was waiting for me. We stepped into the private elevator, ready to fly back to the city that had thrown me away, ready to turn their magnificent victory gala into a public, inescapable slaughterhouse. The grand ballroom of the Chicago Ritz-Carlton was transformed into a monument to Richard Thorne's monumental ego. He had spared absolutely no expense for the public signing of the acquisition, draining the very last drops of the dealership's legitimate operational capital to fund a spectacle designed to blind his rivals. Towering arrangements of white orchids and imported lilies dominated the center of every table. Two massive ice sculptures carved into the shape of the Thorne Auto Empire logo flanked the main stage, slowly melting under the heat of heavy television production lights. A 10-tier champagne tower anchored the back of the room, flowing continuously with vintage Dom Perignon. Richard had personally invited every major business rival, every local politician he had ever bribed, and a swarm of local media outlets to document his crowning achievement. He wanted the entire city of Chicago to witness his ascension to a 9-figure net worth. The room buzzed with the low, greedy hum of high society, completely unaware that the entire event was funded by fraudulent promises and toxic debt. The Thorne family operated the room like royalty holding court. Patricia glided across the Italian marble floor in a custom emerald gown that cost upward of $20,000. She gripped a crystal flute tightly in her hand, smiling fiercely at the wives of rival dealership owners, entirely fueled by a toxic mixture of vanity and relief. She believed she had permanently secured her position at the absolute pinnacle of Chicago high society. Vanessa stood near the media pit, deliberately positioning herself so the camera flashes caught the blinding glare of the diamonds dripping from her neck and wrists. She was loudly boasting to a circle of fawning socialites about her plans to purchase a massive vacation estate in Aspen by the end of the month. She laughed, tossing her hair back, reveling in the obvious bitter envy of her peers. She looked like a woman who had won the lottery, completely insulated by her own fabricated reality. Jamal stood near the main stage, desperately masking his lingering terror with a suffocating layer of arrogance. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo, nodding smugly at the financial reporters who asked him for quotes about the tech buyout. Internally, Jamal believed he had executed the perfect corporate crime. He believed his doctored ledgers had sailed through the Apex Ventures due diligence portal undetected. He was convinced that the massive influx of cash they were about to receive would perfectly cover his disastrous offshore losses before the federal auditors ever caught wind of the missing pension funds. He looked at Richard, sharing a knowing, arrogant smirk. They truly thought they had won. They thought their frantic scrambling in the dark had gone unnoticed by the very people offering them $100 million. The room fell to a hushed, expectant silence as the hired master of ceremonies tapped a microphone and introduced the man of the hour. Richard Thorne strode up the carpeted steps to the main stage, soaking in the roaring applause. He gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, his chest puffed out with an overwhelming, almost suffocating sense of self-importance. He leaned into the microphone, his voice booming across the grand ballroom, projecting the practiced, utterly fraudulent sincerity he used in his television commercials. "Tonight we are not just celebrating a lucrative business transaction," Richard announced, scanning the crowd of elite guests. "We are celebrating the culmination of 3 decades of blood, sweat, and relentless sacrifice. I built the Thorne Empire entirely from the ground up. I started with a single small lot and a dream. I poured every ounce of my soul into this company, relying on nothing but honest hard work and an unshakable moral compass." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He stood under the bright lights, basking in the adoration of the crowd, completely ignoring the fact that his entire empire was funded by the $5 million he had stolen from my dead mother's trust fund. He spoke of sacrifice and integrity, while the blood of his financial crimes literally paved the floor beneath his expensive leather shoes. Richard gestured grandly toward Jamal, inviting him up to the stage. Jamal stepped to the microphone, smoothing his tie, looking out over the sea of wealthy investors and journalists. "A legacy like ours requires meticulous financial stewardship," Jamal declared, delivering the line without a single flinch of hesitation. "It requires knowing when to take calculated risks, and knowing exactly how to secure the future of our employees and our family. Apex Ventures recognize the pristine health of our operations. They recognize the flawless architecture of our financial strategy. That is why they are here tonight." The crowd erupted into another round of thunderous applause. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the overwhelmed, proud matriarch to absolute perfection. Vanessa cheered loudly from the front row, holding up her diamond-adorned hand for the cameras to capture. A heavy, ornate mahogany table sat in the center of the stage. On top of it lay the final transfer documents, neatly bound in a leather portfolio. A solid gold fountain pen rested beside the paperwork, waiting to finalize the $100 million transaction. Richard walked over to the table, positioning himself perfectly for the press photographers. He checked his heavy gold watch, his smile tightening just a fraction of an inch as the minute hand ticked past the scheduled hour. "We are now waiting on the arrival of the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Ventures," the Master of Ceremonies announced over the sound system, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "The CEO has just arrived at the hotel and is making their way to the grand ballroom to formally execute the acquisition." A wave of excited murmurs rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Business rivals whispered to each other, craning their necks toward the rear of the hall, desperate to see the face of the mysterious West Coast billionaire who was dropping 9 figures in cash on a Midwestern car dealership. Richard stood tall behind the mahogany table, adjusting his posture, ready to shake hands with his savior. Jamal stood right beside him, his eyes locked onto the massive gilded double doors at the back of the room. The entire Thorne family held their breath, completely consumed by their own blinding vanity, eagerly waiting for the exact moment their ultimate victory would be permanently cemented in the public record. The heavy brass handles on the grand ballroom doors finally began to turn. The heavy brass handles on the grand ballroom doors finally began to turn. The massive mahogany panels swung inward with a resonating thud that echoed across the cavernous, opulent space. The ambient chatter of the Chicago elite died instantly, replaced by a dense, suffocating tension. The string quartet playing softly in the corner faltered, the cellist dragging a discordant, screeching note across the strings before falling entirely silent. Hundreds of heads swiveled toward the entrance, expectant smiles freezing on their faces. On the stage, Richard straightened his posture, reaching down to button his custom tuxedo jacket, while Jamal stood at rigid attention, ready to welcome their corporate savior. They fully expected an aging, ruthless corporate tycoon to step across the threshold and hand them their $100 million salvation. Instead, the sharp, rhythmic click of leather heels against Italian marble pierced the absolute silence. The person who stepped into the blinding glare of the media flashbulbs was not a West Coast billionaire patriarch. It was me. I did not walk with the hesitant, eager-to-please posture of the adopted daughter they had abused and discarded. I strode into the ballroom wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit like tactical armor. My hair was pulled back tight, my shoulders were squared, and my gaze was locked dead ahead with a cold, unyielding certainty. The bruised, terrified girl they had thrown into the freezing rain was completely gone. In her place stood a woman exuding absolute, undeniable power. The high society crowd naturally parted, stepping backward in unison to clear a wide path down the center aisle. A low, continuous wave of confused murmurs rippled through the gathered guests. Patricia, standing near the front row in her $20,000 emerald gown, let out a sharp gasp. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the floor with a loud crash that made several socialites jump in fright. Vanessa stared at me, her mouth hanging wide open. The smug, arrogant sneer melted off her face, replaced by a look of total, uncomprehending bewilderment. But the initial shock of my arrival was immediately eclipsed by the terrifying reality of the men flanking my sides. Walking step for step to my right was Harrison Cole. The moment the business elite in the room recognized his face, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to sheer electric panic. Harrison was a legendary figure, a titan of Silicon Valley venture capital, and a man whose mere presence signaled massive corporate upheaval. Whispers of his renowned name tore through the crowd like wildfire. Rival dealership owners turned pale instantly, realizing that Richard had not secured a naive, gullible investor, but had somehow drawn the full focused attention of an apex predator. To my left, and forming a tight, impenetrable phalanx behind us, marched a squad of federal agents. They wore dark, heavy windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned across their chests and backs in stark, bold yellow. Their tactical boots hit the floor in a heavy, synchronized rhythm that sounded exactly like a ticking countdown to execution. They were not corporate lawyers or private security guards. They were the absolute, undeniable force of the United States federal government, moving with grim professional purpose, directly toward the stage where Richard and Jamal stood completely paralyzed. The camera flashes in the media pit erupted into a blinding strobe light effect, capturing every single second of the spectacle. Jamal physically stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the acrylic podium hard. As the chief financial officer who had just transmitted heavily doctored financial ledgers across state lines, the sight of federal agents instantly triggered his deepest, darkest survival instincts. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving an ashen, terrified mask. He knew instantly that his offshore gambling and massive wire fraud had been discovered. Richard, however, was too blinded by his own megalomania to grasp the lethal danger actively closing in on him. His brain aggressively rejected the reality unfolding before his eyes. He assumed I had somehow managed to infiltrate the event as an administrative assistant or a low-level consultant for the venture firm. Desperate to maintain his grand illusion of control and salvage the $100 million buyout, Richard forced a wide plastic smile onto his face and stepped confidently forward to the very edge of the stage. He completely ignored my presence, focusing his desperate, greedy gaze entirely on Harrison Cole. Richard extended his hand outward, his voice booming through the wireless microphone clipped to his lapel, attempting to project absolute authority over the sudden chaos in the room. "Welcome to Chicago, Mr. Harrison Cole," Richard announced, his voice trembling slightly with a pathetic mixture of profound arrogance and rising panic. "I must apologize for the disruption. Security will remove this disgruntled former contractor immediately so we can proceed with the signing of our historic agreement." He snapped his fingers aggressively, gesturing frantically for the hotel guards lining the walls to intervene. But the guards took one look at the federal agents moving in flawless formation and immediately stepped back, refusing to interfere with an active, ongoing federal operation. Harrison did not reach out to shake Richard's hand. He did not even acknowledge the man's existence. Harrison simply stopped at the base of the stairs, crossing his arms over his chest, and watched in silence as I ascended the steps alone. I walked past Richard, leaving his outstretched hand hovering empty and awkward in the air. I moved straight toward the exact center of the stage, my eyes locked intently on the heavy, ornate mahogany table. The leather portfolio containing the final, highly anticipated transfer documents lay completely open, waiting for the final signature that would seal their ultimate fate. The solid gold fountain pen rested right beside it, brilliantly reflecting the harsh glare of the television cameras. The entire room watched in breathless, paralyzed silence as I reached the podium, positioning myself directly between Richard and his $100 million salvation. Richard snatched the solid gold fountain pen from the heavy mahogany table, his knuckles white, gripping it like a useless weapon against the gravity of the moment. He stared at me, his face contorting from arrogant confusion into sudden, blinding realization. The pen slipped from his grip and clattered against the polished wood, rolling off the edge to strike the marble floor. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot. Jamal had backed himself against the far back wall of the stage. He was visibly and violently shaking. His eyes darted frantically from the heavily armed federal agent standing at the base of the stairs to Harrison Cole, whose legendary face was finally connecting in Jamal's terrified mind. The young, arrogant chief financial officer instantly understood the lethal magnitude of his error. He had not scammed a faceless, gullible entity out of $100 million. He had handed his doctored illegal corporate ledgers directly to the apex predator of Silicon Valley. Jamal grasped his chest, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs, looking like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows. From the front row, the spell of stunned silence finally shattered. Vanessa leaped to her feet, her $20,000 gown rustling aggressively. She pointed a diamond-encrusted finger at me, her face flushed with unhinged, desperate rage. "Security!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Get that trash out of this room. She is a fraud. She is ruining our signing. Throw her out right now." The remaining hotel guards shifted uncomfortably, reaching for their radios. But the federal agents at the base of the stage simply turned their heads. They fixed Vanessa with a collective, dead-eyed, authoritative stare that instantly silenced her screaming. Nobody moved a single muscle to touch me. I completely ignored my sister's frantic meltdown. I did not give her a single glance. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, pushing the microphone slightly to the side to clear my workspace. I reached into the breast pocket of my custom-tailored charcoal suit and withdrew a sleek silver flash drive. Without a single word of explanation, I inserted the drive directly into the main presentation terminal embedded in the podium. The massive high-definition screens hanging behind the stage flickered aggressively. The glowing corporate holding logo of Apex Ventures instantly vanished. The crowd leaned forward collectively, expecting to see the finalized $100 million acquisition contract ready for digital signatures. Instead, the screens illuminated the grand ballroom with a stark, undeniable truth. A massive high-resolution scan of a legal document filled the primary display. It was heavily stamped yellowed with age and dated 1998. The official heading read, Emergency Decree of Wardship and Adoption. Right beside it, a second document appeared on the split screen. It was a certified financial ledger from a major national bank. The account name clearly read, the Natalie Thorne Irrevocable Care Trust. But the final name printed at the bottom of the establishment papers was not Thorne. The name establishing the $5 million trust was Harrison Cole. A sharp collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The elite guests, politicians, and business rivals stared at the massive screens, their eyes reading the highlighted sections I had carefully prepared. I pressed a button on the terminal, bringing up the most damning piece of evidence. A timeline of banking transactions rolled down the presentation screens, perfectly synchronized with corresponding commercial property deeds. Every single transfer out of the $5 million trust fund was explicitly linked to the initial purchasing agreements for the very first Thorne luxury auto dealership. The dates aligned flawlessly. The dollar amounts matched to the exact cent. The crowd was reading the absolute destruction of a 30-year lie. They were watching the heroic origin story of the great self made Richard Thorne evaporate into a calculated act of theft against a traumatized 5-year-old girl. I stepped back to the microphone, my voice echoing crisp and cold across the massive ballroom. There is no $100 million buyout tonight, I announced, silencing the entire room. Apex Ventures LLC does not buy toxic, failing dealerships. It serves as a trap for desperate, arrogant thieves who steal from dead women and orphaned children. Richard's face drained of all color. He looked utterly destroyed, his entire legacy dissolving right in front of his most hated rivals and esteemed peers. He opened his mouth to speak, to yell, to spin another lie, but the sheer weight of the federal documents displayed above his head crushed his voice. You told everyone you built this empire from the ground up. I continued, my gaze locked onto Richard's terrified face. You told this city you were a titan of industry. You told me I was a useless burden, a charity case that you generously rescued from the gutter. But the screens behind you tell the actual story. I pointed to the massive displays, forcing him to turn and look at the evidence of his own crimes. You stole my identity, I stated, the absolute certainty in my tone, leaving no room for denial. You bribed a corrupt lawyer to bypass the legal system while my real father lay in a coma. You funneled $5 million out of my care trust and used every single penny to buy your first showroom. You never earned your wealth, Richard. You simply robbed a 5-year-old girl because you were nothing but a desperate, failed accountant looking for a shortcut. Patricia, standing in the front row, let out a loud, pathetic sob. She covered her face with her hands as the wealthy socialites she had spent years trying to impress physically stepped away from her, creating a circle of absolute isolation around the Thorne matriarch. Jamal had slid down the wall, sitting on the stage floor, his head buried in his hands. He knew the adoption fraud was only the beginning. He knew exactly what the next slide on that presentation would be. I pressed the button on the podium one final time. The adoption papers and trust ledgers vanished. In their place, a terrifying new document appeared. It was Jamal's heavily doctored financial statement, the exact file he had transmitted across state lines just 24 hours earlier, laid bare alongside the genuine catastrophic debt ledgers uncovered by the forensic team. The blatant multi-million-dollar wire fraud was now broadcast in high definition for the entire Chicago business community to scrutinize. "You are not selling your company today," I declared, stepping away from the podium and looking down at the shattered remains of my former family. "You are being seized. Everything you own, every car, every house, every piece of jewelry was built on stolen money and desperate financial crimes. As of this morning, my legal team has frozen every single asset attached to the Thorne name." The absolute silence in the ballroom broke as the heavily armed federal agents at the base of the stairs finally began to move forward. Their heavy tactical boots thumped against the stage steps, a rhythmic pounding that sounded exactly like a death knell for the entire Thorne empire. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern and unyielding expression, pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his utility belt. He walked directly up to Richard. Richard stumbled backward, bumping hard into the acrylic podium, his chest heaving as the reality of his total destruction finally pierced his monumental ego. Richard Thorne, the lead agent, announced, his voice carrying clearly over the dead-silent ballroom. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and historical embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." Richard raised his trembling hands, his face flushed a deep, terrifying purple. "You cannot do this to me," he bellowed, spit flying from his lips as he frantically looked at the reporters. "I am a pillar of this city. I know the mayor. I know the governor. Call my lawyers right now." The agent did not blink. He grabbed Richard's wrist, twisted his arms firmly behind his back, and locked the steel cuffs securely into place with a sharp, echoing snap. The sound made the remaining high society guests flinch in unison. The titan of Chicago auto sales was instantly reduced to a red-faced, screaming criminal. Another team of agents surrounded Jamal. Jamal did not fight. He did not scream or demand a lawyer. The young, arrogant chief financial officer simply collapsed inward. He fell to his knees on the stage floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The agents hauled him to his feet, securing his wrists, while calmly reading him his rights. Jamal looked out at the crowd of investors and journalists he had tried to scam just minutes earlier. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He knew his fraudulent ledgers and offshore cryptocurrency gambling had just earned him decades in a federal penitentiary. From the front row of the audience, a piercing, hysterical scream shattered the tension. Vanessa lunged forward, her $20,000 gown tearing at the hem as she scrambled toward the stage. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face contorted with absolute madness. The heavy diamond necklace she wore sparkled brightly, a cruel mockery of the bankruptcy that had just slammed into her life. "You ruined everything!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking as two security officers intercepted her, blocking her path to the stage. "You jealous, vindictive trash! I will kill you. I will make sure you never work again." I looked down at my sister, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical pity. "You do not have a career to ruin anymore, Vanessa," I said, my voice projecting effortlessly through the microphone. "Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit cards are dead. You are wearing stolen diamonds. The only thing you have left is the reality of who you truly are, and that is absolutely nothing." Vanessa let out a guttural sob, dropping to the floor and burying her face in her hands. The reality that her life of endless luxury and social media vanity was permanently extinguished finally broke her completely. Then came the most pathetic display of the night. Patricia, the icy matriarch who had spent 33 years treating me like a disgusting burden, suddenly broke through the line of security guards. She scrambled up the side stairs of the stage, her perfectly styled hair falling into complete disarray. She dropped heavily to her knees right in front of me. She reached out her manicured hands, desperately grabbing the fabric of my custom-tailored suit jacket. "Natalie, please!" Patricia wept, tears streaming down her face, completely abandoning the high society pride she valued above all else. "Please, sweetheart. Look at me. I am your mother. I raised you. We gave you a home when you had nothing. You cannot do this to your family. Call them off. Tell these men to let your father go." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had locked me out in the freezing rain just weeks ago. I slowly reached down and firmly removed her clutching hands from my jacket. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke clearly enough for the microphone to catch every single syllable. "You did not raise me, Patricia," I said, my words dropping like heavy anvils onto the stage. "You held me hostage. You used my dead mother's blood money to feed your own arrogance. You dressed me in rags while you bought yourself emeralds. We were never family. You were simply my warden, and your shift is officially over." Patricia let out a devastated, wailing cry, collapsing entirely onto the hardwood floor of the stage. She curled into a ball, weeping uncontrollably, as the elite socialites she had spent decades trying to impress looked on with profound disgust. I turned my back on them. I did not look at Richard as he was dragged away shouting empty threats. I did not look at Jamal, who was paralyzed by his own cowardice. I walked gracefully down the center stairs of the stage, meeting Harrison Cole at the bottom. My biological father offered me his arm, his eyes shining with immense, unbreakable pride. Together we walked down the wide center aisle of the grand ballroom. The crowd of billionaires, politicians, and journalists parted for us, clearing a respectful path. The camera flashes illuminated our exit, capturing the exact moment I walked away from the Thorne family, forever. We stepped out through the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the ruins of their empire smoldering behind us. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The federal prosecutors did not offer leniency. Richard and Jamal were indicted on dozens of counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and historical financial crimes. They are currently facing 20 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. The commercial banks immediately seized the dealerships, liquidating every single vehicle and property to cover the toxic shadow loans Jamal had hidden. Patricia and Vanessa lost absolutely everything. The mansion was foreclosed upon. The luxury cars were repossessed. The diamonds were confiscated to pay restitution to the banks. They were evicted with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The last I heard, they were living in a cheap, rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, forced to work minimum wage jobs just to survive. The high society circle they worshipped entirely blacklisted them. They became toxic pariahs, completely erased from the elite world they once ruled with such cruelty. As for me, I legally reclaimed my birth name. I am Natalie Cole. I relocated to California, stepping onto the balcony of Harrison's estate overlooking the sunlit Pacific Ocean. The $5 million that Richard stole was fully recovered during the asset seizure, complete with decades of compounded interest. I did not keep the money for myself to buy sports cars or designer dresses. I used my recovered fortune to establish a national legal defense fund. We hire top-tier attorneys to advocate for adopted children who are facing financial exploitation and emotional abuse from their guardians. I took the pain they inflicted on me and turned it into an impenetrable shield for others who cannot fight for themselves. Blood does not make a family respect, and truth do. Sometimes the people who claim to save you are the ones holding you underwater. Have you ever had to fight to take your life back from toxic family members? Share your story in the comments below. The heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots against the polished wooden steps of the stage shattered the paralysis that had gripped the grand ballroom. The federal agents, clad in their dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering, ascended with grim mechanical precision. Their presence was a violent, jarring contrast to the delicate white orchids and the towering champagne pyramids that decorated the room. They moved past me, their eyes locked entirely on the two men standing frozen behind the mahogany table. Richard Thorne simply could not process the reality of his own destruction. His megalomania was so deeply ingrained that even as a federal agent grabbed his custom-tailored shoulder, Richard attempted to swat the man away as if he were nothing more than an unruly valet. He puffed out his chest, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson under the harsh glare of the television production lights. "Take your hands off me," Richard demanded, his voice booming across the silent ballroom. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am a pillar of the Chicago business community. The mayor is sitting in the front row of this very room. You are making a catastrophic mistake, and I will have your badge for this." The lead agent did not blink. He did not care about Richard's wealth, his political connections, or his profound arrogance. He smoothly and forcefully twisted Richard's arm behind his back. The sheer physical dominance of the maneuver forced Richard to bend awkwardly over the podium, his face pressing against the forged financial ledgers he had intended to use to scam $100 million. "Richard Thorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and historical embezzlement," the agent stated, his voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking into place echoed through the microphone still clipped to Richard's lapel. The sound was deafening. The crowd of elite guests, socialites, and rival dealership owners collectively gasped. The politicians Richard had boasted about knowing, immediately began stepping backward, physically retreating into the shadows to avoid being photographed anywhere near the disgraced patriarch. The press photographers in the media pit went into an absolute frenzy. The rapid, blinding flashes of their cameras illuminated the stage like a strobe light, capturing every single angle of Richard Thorne's humiliating downfall. While Richard thrashed and shouted empty threats about calling his lawyers, Jamal's reaction was entirely different. As the chief financial officer, Jamal understood the lethal mathematics of the federal justice system. He knew that wire fraud involving tens of millions of dollars across state lines carried mandatory minimum sentences that would consume the rest of his natural life. He knew there was no high-priced defense attorney in the country who could argue against the pristine, irrefutable metadata we had captured on our servers. Before the two agents assigned to him could even issue a command, Jamal collapsed. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He hit the floor of the stage hard, his expensive tuxedo pants sliding against the polished wood. The confident, arrogant swagger he had paraded around the dealership was completely vaporized. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as tears streamed down his face. "I just did what he told me to do," Jamal sobbed wildly, pointing a shaking finger at Richard. "He made me doctor the ledgers. I had to secure the capital. It was his company. You have to believe me." The absolute cowardice of his betrayal made me feel a wave of clinical disgust. The agents hauled Jamal to his feet, ignoring his pathetic attempts to secure a plea deal right there on the stage. They secured his wrists behind his back, the steel biting into his skin. Down in the front row, the reality of the asset freeze finally pierced Patricia's delusional bubble. The $20,000 emerald gown she wore suddenly meant nothing. The country club memberships, the sprawling mansion, the elite social standing, it had all been seized. She was no longer a wealthy matriarch. She was the wife of an arrested felon with absolutely zero access to her stolen fortune. Patricia broke through the invisible barrier the other guests had formed around her. She scrambled frantically up the side stairs of the stage. She tripped on the hem of her expensive gown, the delicate fabric tearing loudly, but she did not stop. She crawled the last few feet across the hardwood floor and dropped heavily to her knees directly in front of me. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands. Her manicured fingers clamped tightly onto the fabric of my custom-tailored charcoal suit jacket. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess, and dark streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her face. "Natalie, please," Patricia wailed, her voice cracking with a raw, agonizing desperation. "Please look at me. I raised you. We gave you a home when you had absolutely nothing. We took you in. You can't do this to family. Tell them to stop. Tell these men to let your father go. We can fix this privately. Please, Natalie, you can't do this to family." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman weeping at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of empathy. Her tears were not born of remorse for stealing my mother's money or for abusing me my entire life. She was crying because the credit cards were declined. From the edge of the media pit, a piercing, unhinged scream tore through the ballroom. Vanessa had watched her husband get dragged toward the service elevators in handcuffs. She had watched her mother fall to her knees and beg for mercy. The fantasy of becoming a $100 million heiress was officially dead, replaced by the terrifying certainty of total bankruptcy. Vanessa lost her mind. She lunged toward the stage, her face twisted into a mask of pure hysterical hatred. The heavy diamond necklace she wore swung wildly as she thrashed against the two hotel security guards who quickly stepped forward to block her path. "You ruined our lives," Vanessa screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shredding with fury. "You jealous, vindictive trash. You planned this because you could never be one of us. You ruined my husband. You ruined everything. I will kill you. I will make sure you suffer for this." She clawed at the guards, kicking and screaming like a feral animal, completely abandoning any remaining shred of high society dignity. The cameras captured every second of her breakdown, permanently cementing the Thorne family's utter disgrace into the public record. The contrast was absolute. I stood tall, silent, and victorious on the stage, while the people who had terrorized me for decades were reduced to screaming, sobbing wreckage at my feet. The justice I had planned was finally complete. I looked down at Patricia Thorne. She was still kneeling on the hardwood floor of the stage, her manicured fingers digging frantically into the fabric of my custom-tailored suit jacket. Her tear-streaked face was a portrait of absolute wretched desperation. For decades, this woman had wielded her authority over me like a weapon. She had locked me out of holiday dinners, forced me into Vanessa's discarded perfume-soaked clothes, and made sure I never forgot my place at the absolute bottom of her social hierarchy. Now stripped of the stolen wealth that had funded her cruel arrogance, she was reduced to begging a ghost she thought she had successfully buried. I did not feel a single shred of the guilt she was desperately trying to weaponize. I slowly reached down, wrapping my fingers around her wrists. Her skin was cold and clammy, trembling with the sheer terror of her impending bankruptcy. With steady, deliberate force, I pried her hands off my jacket. I let her arms drop uselessly to her sides. She stared up at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization that the emotional manipulation she had relied on for 33 years had completely lost its power. "You didn't raise me," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom and echoing through the microphone with crystal-clear finality. "You held me hostage. You used my mother's blood money to feed your own arrogance. We were never family." The words hung in the heavy air of the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom. They were not delivered with a scream or a plea. They were stated as an absolute, undeniable historical fact. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The illusion of the benevolent, wealthy matriarch shattered completely, leaving nothing but an empty, fraudulent shell. She slumped forward, her forehead pressing against the cold stage floor, weeping with the kind of primal devastation that only comes from losing everything you value in a single, irreversible moment. Down on the main floor, Vanessa had stopped kicking at the security guards. The sheer gravity of my statement had finally penetrated her hysterical rage. She looked at her mother collapsed on the stage, then turned her gaze to the heavy mahogany doors where the federal agents had just dragged her husband out in handcuffs. The glittering diamonds around her neck caught the light of the media flashes one last time, a cruel reminder of the $100 million fantasy that had just evaporated. She sank to her knees, her designer gown pooling around her on the marble floor. She let out a hollow, defeated wail that sounded entirely disconnected from the arrogant sister I once knew. Just hours ago, she was posting photos of her luxury shopping sprees. Now she was a broken woman facing a lifetime of minimum wage survival. I stepped back from the podium, leaving the forged adoption papers and the stolen trust fund ledgers glowing brightly on the massive screens behind me. I turned my back on Patricia. I did not look back at Richard's empty place at the table. I did not spare a single glance for Vanessa weeping in the front row. They were no longer my problem. They were the federal government's problem. I walked gracefully down the center stairs of the stage. At the bottom step, Harrison Cole was waiting for me. My biological father stood tall and proud, his presence radiating an unyielding protective authority. He extended his arm toward me. I slipped my hand through the crook of his elbow, feeling a profound, anchoring sense of safety I had been denied my entire life. Together we turned and began the long walk down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The crowd of elite socialites, rival auto dealers, and stunned politicians parted instantly. They stepped back respectfully, clearing a wide, unobstructed path for us. No one dared to speak. No one tried to intervene or offer false sympathies to the Thorne family. The high society crowd had witnessed the absolute destruction of a corporate titan, and they understood perfectly well that the woman walking past them was the architect of that ruin. Business rivals who had been shaking Richard's hand 20 minutes ago were already pulling out their phones, frantically texting their legal teams to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Thorne empire. The press photographers in the media pit lowered their cameras, slightly capturing our departure with a sense of awe. They had come to document a massive corporate acquisition, but instead they had been handed the greatest financial scandal in Chicago history. Tomorrow morning, the headlines would not feature Richard Thorne's triumphant smile. They would feature the grim, undeniable truth of his crimes, accompanied by the images of his spectacular public arrest and Patricia's tearful collapse. As we approached the heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the ballroom, a profound, sweeping sense of liberation washed over me. The suffocating weight of the Thorne family's expectations, their constant degrading criticism, and their relentless psychological warfare lifted completely from my shoulders. I was no longer the family embarrassment. I was no longer the quiet, desperate freelancer begging for a scrap of validation. I was a woman who had faced her abusers, unearthed her true legacy, and executed a flawless, devastatingly precise campaign of ultimate justice. Harrison pushed the heavy brass handles and the doors swung outward, revealing the quiet, softly lit corridors of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The chaotic noise of the grand ballroom, the frantic murmurs of the guests, and the pathetic, echoing sobs of Patricia and Vanessa were instantly muted as the doors closed securely behind us. We walked through the opulent lobby, moving past the bewildered hotel staff and out into the crisp, cool Chicago night. The storm that had drenched me weeks ago had long since passed. The air was clear and sharp. A fleet of black bulletproof SUVs waited at the curb, their engines purring quietly, ready to take us straight to the airport. I looked up at the towering, illuminated skyline of the city that had hosted my 33 years of captivity. It looked entirely different now. I had arrived in this city with nothing but a bruised cheek and a shattered reality, and I was leaving it having reclaimed my name, my fortune, and my absolute freedom. The federal justice system moves with a terrifying mechanical efficiency when presented with irrefutable evidence of massive financial fraud. Within days of our departure from Chicago, the Thorne auto empire was entirely dismantled piece by piece. Commercial banks executed their foreclosure clauses with absolutely zero mercy. The glittering, spotless showrooms were securely padlocked, the luxury vehicles were loaded onto heavy transport trucks, and the corporate accounts were permanently seized. Richard and Jamal were denied bail, deemed extreme flight risks due to Jamal's desperate offshore connections. They sat in cold federal holding cells while prosecutors meticulously built a case that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Without the stolen funds to hire elite defense attorneys, they were assigned overworked public defenders who immediately advised them to accept plea deals. Their towering arrogance was entirely broken. When the judge finally handed down their 20-year sentences, Richard looked frail, hollow, and utterly destroyed. The collateral damage to Patricia and Vanessa was absolute and instantaneous. The federal government seized the sprawling suburban mansion, the designer wardrobes, the expensive jewelry, and every single bank account associated with the Thorne name to pay restitution to the defrauded lenders. Patricia and Vanessa were literally given 2 hours to pack whatever fit into a couple of basic duffel bags before federal marshals escorted them off the manicured property. The high society elite they had worshipped completely excommunicated them overnight. No country club friend offered them a guest room. No business associate returned their desperate, weeping phone calls. They were forced to rent a cramped, decaying apartment on the far outskirts of the city. To survive, they had to take minimum wage jobs. Patricia, a woman who once bragged about her $20,000 gowns, was now wiping down tables at a local diner, her hands raw from harsh cleaning chemicals. Vanessa, the woman who had proudly posted about becoming a $100 million heiress, was now folding shirts in a discount retail clothing store. She spent her shifts hiding her face whenever a former high society acquaintance walked through the automatic sliding doors. Their reign of toxic vanity was permanently extinguished. While their world collapsed into ruin, my new life was just beginning to bloom. My very first act upon returning to California was completely shedding the fabricated identity they had forced upon me. Standing in a sunlit courthouse in Silicon Valley, accompanied by Harrison and his elite legal team, I signed the documents that officially legally restored my birth name. I was Natalie Cole. The moment the judge stamped the approval, a heavy, suffocating weight that I had carried since childhood completely evaporated. I was no longer a stolen asset. I was a daughter. A few weeks later, I stood on the expansive wooden balcony of Harrison's coastal estate. The cool, salty breeze rolling off the Pacific Ocean carried the fresh scent of pine and sea spray. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in brilliant, breathtaking strokes of gold and violet. Harrison stepped out onto the balcony, handing me a mug of hot tea. He did not say a word, simply resting his hand warmly on my shoulder as we watched the waves crash against the rocky shoreline below. There were no cruel expectations, no impossible demands, and no toxic comparisons. There was only the quiet, profound comfort of genuine parental love. For the first time in 33 years, I felt entirely, undeniably at peace. I had a father who looked at me and saw a living, breathing person, not a profit margin to be exploited. But I knew that simply securing my own freedom was not enough. During the asset seizure in Chicago, Harrison's legal team successfully recovered the original $5 million stolen from my mother's trust, along with decades of massive compounded interest and punitive damages extracted directly from Richard's liquidated estate. I did not use a single cent of that recovered fortune to buy luxury cars or sprawling mansions. Instead, I channeled my mother's legacy into something incredibly powerful. I established the Elena Cole Foundation, a national legal defense fund operating directly out of Silicon Valley. We employed teams of aggressive top-tier attorneys and forensic accountants dedicated entirely to protecting adopted and foster children from financial exploitation. We actively investigate corrupt family court officials, audit suspicious guardianship trusts, and provide free, relentless legal representation to vulnerable kids whose guardians view them as paychecks rather than human beings. We became the apex predators, hunting the people who prey on the defenseless. I took the absolute worst, most agonizing decades of my life and forged them into an impenetrable shield for others. Whenever we win a case and secure a child's rightful future, I know my mother's true legacy is being honored. Blood doesn't make a family. Respect and truth do. Sometimes the people who claim to save you are the ones holding you underwater. Have you ever had to fight to take your life back from toxic family members? Share your story in the comments below. The most profound lesson woven throughout this narrative is that legal documents or shared households do not inherently create a true family. Family is a title earned through mutual respect, unwavering support, and authentic love, rather than an obligation weaponized to control or exploit someone. Throughout the story, the adoptive parents and siblings use the facade of familial loyalty to demand endless gratitude while systematically destroying the protagonist's self-worth and secretly stealing her future. Society often pressures individuals to forgive toxic relatives simply because they share a last name. We are frequently taught to endure emotional manipulation, blatant favoritism, and financial abuse under the guise of maintaining family harmony. However, true strength lies in recognizing when a toxic environment is actively holding you underwater and having the sheer courage to walk away. The protagonist's journey from a terrified, discarded daughter to a powerful, independent woman illustrates that breaking free from a fraudulent family is not an act of betrayal. Instead, it is an act of essential self-preservation. When the people who are supposed to protect you become your absolute greatest threat, setting ironclad boundaries is the only way to survive and reclaim your true identity. True healing begins the moment we stop desperately seeking validation from those completely incapable of giving it. By stepping out of the shadow of abuse and redefining her own success, the protagonist proved that our darkest, most painful experiences can ultimately be transformed into a source of immense strength and protection for others. We must learn to define our own worth rather than letting manipulative abusers dictate our value. Evaluate the relationships in your life today and find the courage to establish firm boundaries that protect your absolute peace and emotional well-being.